The most powerful weapon ever created did not begin on a battlefield. It began in silence. No speeches, no headlines, no parades. Just guarded doors, false names, and a question no one could answer with certainty. What happens if this works? In the middle of a global war already consuming millions of lives, the Manhattan Project unfolded in secrecy so complete that even many of those building it did not fully understand what they were racing toward. Entire cities were constructed from nothing. Thousands of scientists, engineers, soldiers, and workers were isolated from the outside world. And at the center of it all was an idea so radical it reshaped history before anyone could truly grasp its consequences. The Manhattan Project was not born from curiosity. It was born from fear. Fear that Nazi Germany might unlock nuclear power first. Fear that a single breakthrough could decide the war instantly. Fear that hesitation would be fatal. In response, the United States committed resources on a scale never seen outside open combat, pouring money, manpower, and material into an invisible front line stretching from Tennessee to Washington State to the deserts of New Mexico. At places like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford site, the war took on a different shape. Instead of trenches and tanks, there were equations, reactors, and controlled explosions. Instead of front lines, there were clearance badges and armed guards. Leading the effort was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant conflicted figure tasked not only with solving unprecedented scientific problems, but with managing minds racing faster than ethics could keep pace. Under him worked some of the greatest scientific talents of the 20th century, many of them refugees from fascism, all of them aware that failure could mean catastrophe, but knowledge came at a cost. The science was untested. The timelines were unforgiving. The consequences were unknown. Every breakthrough introduced new dangers, critical mass, radiation, chain reactions no one could fully simulate. Progress meant stepping into uncertainty with confidence that bordered on faith. And still, the project moved forward. Factories enriched uranium without workers knowing why. Reactors produced plutonium under constant risk. Designs evolved through trial, error, and controlled disaster. By the time the first test approached, the war in Europe was already nearing its end. The original fear, a German bomb, had faded, but momentum had not. The project had become unstoppable, driven by sunk cost, urgency, and the belief that once created, the weapon must be used. The Trinity Test shattered the desert silence in July of 1945. In that moment, the world crossed a line it could never step back from. The Manhattan Project succeeded not just in ending a war, but in beginning a new era, one defined by deterrence, escalation, and the permanent presence of existential risk. The scientists knew it. Many struggled with it. Some celebrated, others warned. None could undo it. This story is not only about physics, it is about responsibility, about secrecy, about how war accelerates decisions that peace might never allow. The Manhattan Project forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the most consequential battles of the Second World War were not always fought with guns, but with ideas, deadlines, and moral compromise. Tonight, we step inside that hidden war, behind the fences and code names, into the laboratories where the future was assembled piece by piece, into the project that changed warfare and humanity forever. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it for you there? Is this a late night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out to sit with history? And if these long, thoughtful journeys into the past help you slow down, reflect, or understand how deeply war reshapes the world beyond the battlefield, I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of the Manhattan Project. August 2nd, 1939, a summer afternoon on Long Island. Two men in a borrowed car drove through unfamiliar streets, searching for a vacation cottage they'd never seen. Leo Szilard sat beside the driver, Eugene Wigner, clutching an unsigned letter that could change the course of human history. They were lost. The irony wasn't lost on Szilard. Two of the world's most brilliant physicists, unable to navigate suburban roads while carrying a warning about the end of civilization. The cottage belonged to Albert Einstein, and the letter in Szilard's hands explained, in careful technical language, how to build a weapon that could obliterate entire cities. They needed Einstein's signature. They needed it before Adolf Hitler got the bomb first. The journey to this moment had begun 6 years earlier, on a different street, in a different country. September 1933. London. Szilard stood at a traffic light on Southampton Row, waiting for the signal to change. He'd just read about Ernest Rutherford dismissing the idea of atomic energy as moonshine. Something clicked in Szilard's mind as he stepped off the curb. Neutrons striking atoms. Atoms splitting, releasing more neutrons. Those neutrons striking more atoms. A chain reaction, self-sustaining, exponential, unstoppable. By the time he reached the other side of the street, Leo Szilard had conceived of the atomic bomb. He was a Hungarian physicist, a refugee from fascism, a man who understood that ideas have consequences. The thought terrified him. He filed a secret patent, trying to keep the concept from spreading. But secrets, he would learn, have a way of escaping. By 1939, the secret was out, and the implications were catastrophic. German scientists weren't just aware of nuclear fission, they were ahead. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had split the uranium atom in December 1938 in Berlin. Their colleague, Lise Meitner, a Jewish physicist who'd fled to Sweden, had explained what it meant. When a uranium nucleus splits, it releases enormous energy. The calculation was simple and horrifying. Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, meant that a tiny amount of matter could become an enormous amount of energy. A few kilograms of uranium could release as much energy as thousands of tons of TNT. And Germany had uranium, 45 tons of it, seized from Belgian mines in the Congo just months before Szilard and Wigner got lost looking for Einstein's cottage. The Nazis had the ore, the scientists, and a 2-year head start. Szilard knew what others didn't yet understand. America was catastrophically unprepared. The academic community dismissed his warnings. Military officials didn't understand the physics. Politicians had never heard of chain reactions. Szilard needed a name that commanded instant respect. Someone whose authority was unquestionable. He needed Einstein, but Einstein was on vacation, and Szilard didn't know where. He'd enlisted Wigner, who owned a car, and together they'd driven to Long Island with only a vague address. They asked at a local store. No one had heard of Einstein. They were about to give up when a young boy on the street recognized the name and gave them directions. History turned on that chance encounter. If that boy hadn't known where Einstein summered, if Szilard and Wigner had given up and gone home, would America have built the bomb at all? They found the cottage. Einstein answered the door in casual clothes, surprised to see them. They sat at his kitchen table, and Szilard explained the danger. Einstein listened, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern to something like horror. "I never thought of that," he said quietly when Szilard described how a chain reaction could be weaponized. It was a stunning admission. The man who'd unlocked the relationship between mass and energy hadn't imagined someone would use it to build bombs, but now that it had been explained, Einstein saw it clearly. The physics was sound, the danger was real, and if the Germans succeeded first, they could win the war before it properly began. Einstein agreed to sign the letter. He picked up a pen. His signature, neat and familiar, went onto a document addressed to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The letter was dated August 2nd, 1939. It warned that uranium could be made into extremely powerful bombs of a new type. It urged immediate action. It suggested the United States secure uranium supplies and accelerate nuclear research. Einstein signed it and handed it back to Szilard. The letter was complete. Now they just needed to deliver it. That proved harder than writing it. The letter sat in Washington for more than 2 months, bouncing between officials who didn't understand its importance. Szilard had given it to Alexander Sachs, an economist and informal advisor to Roosevelt, believing Sachs could get the president's attention. But Sachs couldn't get an appointment. September passed. October began. War erupted in Europe. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st. Britain and France declared war on Germany. The conflict Szilard feared had started, and the letter still hadn't reached Roosevelt. Sachs finally secured a meeting for October 11th, 1939. He arrived at the White House carrying Einstein's letter and additional materials explaining the science. Roosevelt was distracted, preoccupied with the war in Europe and political battles at home. He barely glanced at the letter. Sachs realized he was losing the president's attention. So he did something desperate and brilliant. He stopped trying to explain the science and told a story instead. Sachs told Roosevelt about a young inventor who'd approached Napoleon Bonaparte with a new technology, steamships that could revolutionize naval warfare. Napoleon had dismissed the idea as impractical. Years later, Britain used steamships to dominate the seas, and France never caught up. The point was clear. Ignoring new technology doesn't make it go away. It just ensures your enemies get it first. Roosevelt understood immediately. He called in his aide, General Edwin Pay Watson, and said, "Pay, this requires action." It was the response Sachs had hoped for, the moment when the United States government acknowledged that atomic weapons were possible and dangerous. But acknowledgement didn't mean urgency. Roosevelt authorized the creation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium, a panel of scientists to study the problem. The committee's initial budget was $6,000. $6,000 to counter a German program that had years of head start and access to tons of uranium ore. It was almost insulting. The Uranium Committee met in Washington, reviewed the science, and concluded that atomic bombs were theoretically possible but impractical in the near term. They recommended modest research funding and moved on to other wartime priorities. Szilard was furious. $6,000 couldn't build anything. It couldn't even properly study the problem. Meanwhile, German scientists were working in well-funded laboratories in Berlin, conducting experiments on chain reactions, refining uranium, exploring plutonium. The German Army Ordnance Office had designated nuclear research a priority. Hitler's regime understood, at least intuitively, that whoever built an atomic bomb first would win the war. America's response was a committee meeting and a token budget. For 2 years, that's how it remained. Small-scale research, academic interest, no industrial effort. Szilard watched in mounting frustration as bureaucracy and skepticism delayed action. He wrote more letters. He lobbied more officials. He tried to convey urgency to people who didn't understand the physics or believe the timeline. What Szilard couldn't have known, what no one in America knew in 1939 or 1940 or even 1941, was that the German program was less advanced than feared and more chaotic than imagined. Werner Heisenberg, Germany's leading nuclear physicist, had made critical miscalculations about how much uranium was needed for a bomb. The Nazi regime's anti-Semitic policies had driven out many of Germany's best scientists, gutting the country's research capacity. German physicists were exploring nuclear power for submarines, not rushing toward weapons. The threat was real, but not imminent. But America didn't know that. They couldn't know. Intelligence about German nuclear research was fragmentary and terrifying. Every assumption erred on the side of worst-case scenarios, that Germany was farther ahead, more focused, more dangerous. Those assumptions, rooted in fear and incomplete information, would drive American decision-making for the next 6 years. By December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered the war, the Manhattan Project still didn't exist. The Uranium Committee had produced reports. Universities had conducted small experiments. Nothing had been built. Nothing had been proven. No one had achieved a sustained chain reaction. No one had enriched uranium to weapons-grade concentration. No one had isolated plutonium in measurable quantities. The atomic bomb remained theoretical, a possibility described in equations but not demonstrated in reality. It would take a different kind of leadership to change that. Someone who understood that winning wars required more than committees and budgets. It required construction, production, results. That person was already working in Washington, building the largest office building in the world. His name was Leslie Groves, and in September 1942, he would take control of a project that would consume $2 billion, employ 130,000 people, and change warfare forever. But that came later. First, someone had to convince the government to try. June 4th, 1942, Berlin. Werner Heisenberg sat across from Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, in the Harnack House conference room. Outside, the Wehrmacht was advancing toward Stalingrad. Inside, Germany's most brilliant physicist was making a pitch that would determine the course of the war. Speer had called this meeting to hear about the uranium project, to understand if atomic weapons could help Germany win. Heisenberg had prepared carefully. He explained fission, chain reactions, critical mass. Speer listened with the attention of a man whose decisions killed or saved millions. Then Speer asked the question that mattered. How much would it cost? How long would it take? Could Germany build an atomic bomb before the war ended? Heisenberg's answer doomed the German program. He said it would require massive industrial resources, years of work, uncertain results. He didn't ask for a crash program. He didn't demand priority over other weapons. He asked for modest support, academic funding, permission to continue research. Speer left that meeting unconvinced that atomic bombs were practical wartime weapons. He allocated limited resources to the uranium project and focused Germany's industrial capacity elsewhere, on rockets, jets, tanks. In that conference room, Germany lost the atomic race, and no one realized it for years. The German nuclear program had started with advantages America lacked. In 1938, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had split the uranium atom at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, the discovery that proved fission was possible. Lise Meitner, their colleague who'd fled Nazi persecution, had explained the physics while in Swedish exile. German scientists understood the implications immediately. Within months, the German Army Ordnance Office had recruited leading physicists into a secret program called the Uranverein, the Uranium Club. They had laboratories, funding, institutional support. They had something else too, access to heavy water, a substance crucial for certain types of nuclear reactors. The Norsk Hydro plant in German-occupied Norway was producing heavy water at scale, shipping barrels of it to laboratories in Berlin and Leipzig. Heavy water, chemically similar to ordinary water, but with deuterium instead of hydrogen, could slow neutrons without absorbing them, making it an ideal moderator for uranium reactors. Germany had secured the world's only significant supply. But the German program suffered from problems that would prove fatal. The first was ideological. The Nazi regime had designated certain scientific theories as Jewish physics, corrupt, degenerate, un-German. Relativity and quantum mechanics fell into this category. These were precisely the theories needed to understand atomic bombs. While some Nazi officials quietly tolerated them for military purposes, the overall atmosphere discouraged the kind of open, collaborative research that drives scientific progress. Germany had expelled or murdered many of its best physicists, Jews, communists, anyone politically suspect. Lise Meitner had fled to Sweden. Albert Einstein had fled to America. Hans Bethe, Otto Frisch, Rudolf Peierls, names that would become central to the Manhattan Project, had left Germany because staying meant death. The brain drain had gutted German physics, and ideology made it impossible to repair the damage. The second problem was administrative chaos. Unlike the centralized Manhattan Project, Germany's nuclear research was fractured into competing fiefdoms. Werner Heisenberg led one effort at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Kurt Diebner led another at the Army Ordnance Testing Grounds. The Reich Post Office ran its own nuclear experiments, convinced they'd succeed where the physicists failed. Different branches of the military pursued separate agendas. No one had overall authority. No one could make final decisions. Resources were divided, duplicating effort and wasting time. Heisenberg and Diebner feuded over reactor designs. Different teams tried different approaches to uranium enrichment. Meetings devolved into academic arguments while the war slipped away. The system that gave Germany tanks, submarines, and jets couldn't organize its scientists into a coherent program. American intelligence didn't know this. They saw Germany's early lead and assumed German efficiency would produce results. The third problem was technical. a miscalculation that condemned the German effort from the start. Heisenberg had calculated the critical mass for a uranium bomb, the amount of enriched uranium needed to sustain a chain reaction. He got it wrong. His equation suggested tons of uranium-235 would be needed, perhaps as much as 13 tons. The true figure was closer to 50 kilograms, less than 1% of Heisenberg's estimate. This error cascaded through the entire program. If a bomb needed tons of enriched uranium, then building one was obviously impossible during wartime. Germany couldn't enrich tons of uranium with the industrial capacity available, so they didn't seriously try. Instead, they focused on reactors for power generation, thinking bombs were years away. American scientists, working independently, calculated the critical mass correctly. They knew a bomb needed kilograms, not tons. They knew it was achievable. That difference in calculation created a difference in urgency that decided the race. Still, the German program made progress in areas that terrified Allied intelligence. By early 1942, German physicists had demonstrated neutron multiplication in uranium, proof that chain reactions were possible. They'd built experimental reactors in Leipzig and Berlin, using uranium oxide and heavy water. The reactors didn't achieve sustained chain reactions, but they came close, reaching multiplication factors of 6 or 7 when they needed 100 for a self-sustaining reaction. Heisenberg understood the physics. His notebooks showed detailed calculations about reactor design and bomb efficiency. If Germany corrected its errors, if it mobilized industrial resources, if it achieved what American scientists were attempting, enriching uranium or producing plutonium at scale, then the war could end very differently. Allied leaders, reading fragmentary intelligence reports, assumed the worst. They imagined German scientists on the verge of success, racing to build bombs that could obliterate London or Moscow. One substance symbolized the German threat: heavy water. The Norsk hydro plant at Vemork in occupied Norway produced it as a byproduct of fertilizer manufacturing. German scientists needed heavy water for their reactor experiments. The plant was producing about 120 kilograms per month by 1942, with capacity to increase production. British intelligence identified Vemork as a critical target. If Germany's nuclear program depended on heavy water, then destroying the plant could stop the program entirely. The British authorized Operation Freshman in November 1942, 2 gliders carrying Royal Engineer commandos, tasked with sabotaging Vemork. Both gliders crashed in Norway. The commandos who survived the crashes were captured and executed by the Gestapo under Hitler's commando order. The mission failed completely, but it signaled British desperation. They tried again in February 1943 with Operation Gunnerside, using Norwegian resistance fighters trained in Britain. This time, they succeeded. The night of February 27th to 28th, 1943. 6 Norwegian commandos skied across frozen terrain, climbed a steep gorge, and infiltrated the Vemork plant. They placed explosive charges on the heavy water production cells and escaped without firing a shot. The explosions destroyed months of accumulated heavy water and crippled production equipment. German forces flooded the area with troops, searching for the saboteurs, but the Norwegians had vanished into the winter wilderness. The operation became legendary, the heroes of Telemark, though its strategic impact remained debated. Germany repaired the plant and resumed production. But the raid demonstrated that Allied intelligence was tracking the German program and taking active measures to sabotage it. It showed how seriously Britain and America took the threat, even if the threat was less advanced than they feared. The most mysterious episode of the German program occurred in September 1941, when Heisenberg traveled to Copenhagen to meet his former mentor, Niels Bohr. Bohr, a Danish Jew, had remained in occupied Denmark, protected by his international fame. Heisenberg arrived with German minders, ostensibly for a scientific conference, and requested a private walk with Bohr. What happened during that walk has been debated for 80 years. Heisenberg later claimed he tried to warn Bohr about atomic weapons, to suggest that physicists on both sides should refuse to build bombs. Bohr remembered it differently. He thought Heisenberg was probing to see how much the Allies knew, perhaps recruiting him for the German program. The conversation ended badly. Bohr was shaken, convinced Heisenberg had revealed that Germany was pursuing a bomb. After the war, Heisenberg defended himself, insisting he'd tried to prevent the weapon. Drafts of Bohr's unsent letters, released decades later, suggested deep anger at Heisenberg's version of events. The truth died with both men. All that's certain is that the meeting convinced Bohr to flee Denmark in 1943 and join the Manhattan Project, bringing his expertise to the Allied effort. By mid-1943, the German program had stagnated. Resources flowed to more immediate weapons, V-2 rockets, jet fighters, improved tanks. The Uranium Club continued experiments, building small reactors, refining calculations, but without the industrial scale needed for weapons. When Allied forces captured German nuclear facilities in 1945, they found laboratories, not factories. They found physicists conducting research, not engineers building bombs. The German program had never transitioned from science to engineering, from theory to production. American scientists reading captured documents were shocked at how far behind the Germans had fallen. But in 1942 and 43, when decisions about the Manhattan Project were being made, no one knew that. The ghost of German nuclear science haunted every decision, driving urgency, justifying costs, rationalizing risks. The race against Germany shaped the Manhattan Project, even though, by the time the first bombs were ready, Germany had surrendered and the race had been illusory all along. What remained after the war was mystery and argument. 10 German scientists, including Heisenberg, were captured and detained at Farm Hall, an estate in England, where British intelligence secretly recorded their conversations. The transcripts, released in 1992, revealed their shock when they learned about Hiroshima. Some didn't believe it at first. They insisted an atomic bomb was impossible, or that the Allies were lying. Others realized immediately what it meant. They had failed where their former colleagues had succeeded. Heisenberg spent hours recalculating critical mass, trying to understand where his math had gone wrong. Otto Hahn, who discovered fission, was distraught, feeling responsible for the weapon's use. The recordings captured German physicists confronting their own failure and its implications. Did they fail because of ideology, administrative chaos, and miscalculation? Or did they, consciously or unconsciously, hold back from building a weapon for Hitler? The answer probably varied by individual and changed over time. What's certain is that the German program never seriously threatened to produce atomic bombs during World War II, but the fear that it might drove America to build them first, faster, and at any cost. September 17, 1942, Washington, D.C. Colonel Leslie Richard Groves sat in his Pentagon office, expecting orders to ship overseas. He'd spent the last year and a half building the Pentagon itself, 5 floors, 17.5 miles of corridors, the largest office building in the world, completed in 16 months, despite everyone saying it was impossible. Groves had managed 40,000 construction workers, navigated bureaucratic obstacles, bullied suppliers, and delivered results. Now, with the building finished, he wanted combat command. He wanted to fight in Europe or the Pacific, to lead men in battle, to earn his place in military history. Instead, he was summoned to the office of General Wilhelm Steyr, who informed him he'd been assigned to a different project. It was called the Manhattan Engineer District. Groves had never heard of it. When Steyr explained what it involved, building atomic bombs, overseeing scientists, managing secret construction projects, Groves called it the worst disappointment of his life. He didn't want to babysit physicists. He wanted to fight a war. But orders were orders, and Leslie Groves didn't refuse assignments. He left Steyr's office and went directly to meet the project's military leadership. By the end of that first day, Groves understood he'd been handed the most important job in the war. This wasn't bureaucratic makework. This was a chance to build a weapon that could end the conflict, save American lives, and change the strategic balance forever. The previous leadership had been cautious, academic, slow-moving. Groves was none of those things. He was 46 years old, overweight, abrasive, and relentlessly efficient. Scientists would mock him behind his back, calling him General Bluster, and making jokes about his weight. Groves didn't care. He knew how to build at scale, how to cut through red tape, how to make the impossible happen on impossible timelines. He'd proven it with the Pentagon. Now he'd prove it with something far more difficult. Groves' first meeting with project scientists took place on September 18, 1942, at 10 in the morning. By 4 that afternoon, he'd authorized spending $100 million without seeking approval from his superiors. The previous leadership had spent months debating expenditures, forming committees, studying options. Groves looked at what needed to be built: uranium enrichment plants, plutonium production reactors, a secret weapons laboratory, and started spending. He understood that time was the enemy. Every day of delay was a day Germany might solve the problem first. Every month of bureaucratic review was a month closer to having the weapon arrive too late to matter. Groves operated on a principle that terrified cautious administrators: ask forgiveness, not permission. If something needed doing, he ordered it done and explained later. If someone couldn't deliver, he found someone who would. His management style was ruthless and effective. Within days, Groves had transformed the Manhattan Project from a research program into an industrial undertaking. He visited the University of California at Berkeley to meet Ernest Lawrence, whose electromagnetic separation process showed promise for enriching uranium. He went to Chicago to inspect the metallurgical laboratory, where Enrico Fermi was building an experimental reactor. He toured potential sites for production facilities, evaluating locations based on power availability, water supply, isolation, and security. He made decisions in hours that committees had debated for months. The gaseous diffusion plant would be built in Tennessee. The plutonium reactors would go to Washington State. The weapons laboratory would be established somewhere remote, far from cities and prying eyes. Groves didn't know exactly where yet, but he knew it had to be isolated, secure, and large enough to house thousands of scientists and technicians. Groves understood something the previous leadership had missed. Building an atomic bomb wasn't a physics problem. It was an engineering problem, an industrial problem, a logistics problem. Yes, the science was unprecedented. Yes, the physics was cutting edge. But science without production was useless. You couldn't win a war with theories and equations. You won with functional weapons delivered to the military on time. That meant factories, not laboratories. It meant industrial-scale production, not small-scale experiments. It meant treating the Manhattan Project like any other massive construction effort: the Panama Canal, the Hoover Dam, the Pentagon, but with the added complexity that no one knew if what they were building would actually work. To give himself the authority needed for such an undertaking, Groves demanded a promotion. He was a colonel, but the project required interacting with high-ranking officials and commandeering resources from other military priorities. He needed rank to get cooperation. The Army promoted him to brigadier general, and Groves immediately used his new authority to secure the highest priority rating available: AAA. This designation, above the priority given to any other wartime project, meant the Manhattan Project could requisition materials, draft workers, and claim resources ahead of everything else, ahead of aircraft production, shipbuilding, tank factories. It was an extraordinary level of authority for a project most military officials had never heard of, and many didn't believe would work. With authority came responsibility and pressure. Groves knew that if the Manhattan Project failed, if it consumed billions of dollars and produced nothing, he would be blamed. His career would end in disgrace. Worse, if Germany built a bomb first, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for Groves personally, but for the Allied war effort and civilization itself. This dual pressure, the possibility of failure and the necessity of success, drove Groves to extremes. He worked 18-hour days. He tolerated no excuses. When suppliers said something couldn't be delivered on time, Groves told them to find a way. When engineers said a design was too difficult, Groves told them to solve it. When scientists complained about military oversight, Groves reminded them there was a war on and people were dying. His most controversial decision came early, choosing who would lead the scientific effort at the weapons laboratory. The obvious candidates were established figures with management experience: Arthur Compton, Ernest Lawrence, Harold Urey, but Groves looked past them to someone unexpected: J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist at Berkeley with no administrative experience and a deeply problematic security file. Oppenheimer had attended Communist Party meetings, donated to leftist causes, and maintained friendships with party members. His brother was a communist. His wife's ex-husband had died fighting for communists in Spain. Every security officer who reviewed Oppenheimer's file recommended against clearance. But Groves saw something others missed: charisma, brilliance, and the ability to inspire. Oppenheimer could talk to experimentalists and theorists, chemists and engineers. He understood the full scope of the problem. He could hold the big picture in his mind while attending to details. He was, Groves concluded, a genius who could manage geniuses. The security objections were significant. Army counterintelligence considered Oppenheimer an unacceptable risk. They produced files documenting his associations, his fundraising for Spanish Republicans, his attendance at Berkeley faculty club meetings where communist literature circulated. Groves read it all and made his decision anyway. He told the security officers, "He's my choice. We can watch him." It was a calculated risk that violated every normal security protocol. Groves justified it on simple grounds. Oppenheimer was the best person for the job, and winning the war required taking risks. If Oppenheimer proved disloyal, Groves would deal with it. If Oppenheimer succeeded in building a bomb, the risk would be justified. It was cold logic applied to a human question, and it worked, though Oppenheimer would pay a terrible price for Groves' gamble a decade later. By October 1942, barely 6 weeks into his tenure, Groves had revolutionized the Manhattan Project. He'd secured funding, claimed sites, promoted himself, and chosen Oppenheimer. He'd turned a stagnant research program into an industrial juggernaut that would eventually employ 130,000 people, consume 1/7 of America's electrical power, and cost $2 billion. None of it had been approved through normal channels. Much of it was technically illegal, committed on Groves' authority alone. But it was happening, and happening fast, because Leslie Groves understood something fundamental about bureaucracy in wartime. Momentum matters more than permission. Once you start building, once you commit resources and hire people and pour concrete, it becomes politically impossible to stop. The Manhattan Project was no longer a question. It was a fact, already underway, already irreversible. Groves had made it so through sheer force of will and disregard for normal procedure. The costs were high, and not just in dollars. Groves' management style created enemies. Scientists hated his bluntness, his lack of deference to academic credentials, his insistence that they work to military schedules. Administrators resented his end runs around proper channels. Security officers distrusted his willingness to overlook Oppenheimer's background. But Groves didn't need to be liked. He needed to deliver a weapon before Germany did. Everything else, politeness, protocol, popularity, was secondary. In the calculus of total war, results justified methods. And by that measure, Leslie Groves succeeded spectacularly. The Manhattan Project he built in late 1942 would, within 3 years, produce weapons that ended the war and inaugurated the atomic age. But first, he needed to find a place for Oppenheimer to work, a laboratory at the end of the world, hidden from enemies and isolated from distractions. That search would lead him to New Mexico, to a mesa overlooking the desert, to a boys' school that would become the most important scientific facility in history. October 1942, Berkeley, California. Robert Oppenheimer walked across campus with General Leslie Groves, discussing the impossible, building an atomic bomb. Oppenheimer was 38 years old, thin, chain-smoking, intense. He spoke rapidly, switching between physics and poetry, quoting Sanskrit and solving equations in his head. Groves had arrived expecting to evaluate Oppenheimer for the weapons laboratory directorship. What he found was something unexpected. Not just a scientist, but a leader. Oppenheimer had never managed more than a few graduate students, yet he spoke with absolute confidence about organizing thousands of people to solve problems no one had solved before. He understood the physics. Of course, he understood the physics, but he also understood people, politics, psychology. He knew how to inspire, how to persuade, how to make others believe in seemingly impossible goals. By the end of their walk, Groves had made his decision. This strange, brilliant man, with the communist associations and the Sanskrit quotations, would lead the scientific effort. The security officers would have to deal with it. Oppenheimer's path to Los Alamos had been circuitous, marked by privilege, tragedy, and radical politics. Born in New York in 1904 to a wealthy textile importer and an artist mother, he'd grown up surrounded by culture and intellectual ambition. He attended the Ethical Culture School, studied at Harvard, earned his doctorate in theoretical physics at Göttingen in Germany. He'd worked with the giants of quantum mechanics, Max Born, Werner Heisenberg, Paul Dirac. By the 1930s, he'd established himself as America's leading theorist, splitting time between Berkeley and Caltech, training a generation of American physicists. He read widely: French poetry, Hindu philosophy, radical politics. He learned Sanskrit to read the Bhagavad Gita in its original language. His students worshipped him. His colleagues found him brilliant and exhausting. He was everything a weapons project director shouldn't be: impractical, poetic, politically suspect. The political problems were real and deep. In the 1930s, Oppenheimer had moved in circles saturated with Communist Party members. He attended fundraisers for Spanish Civil War Republicans, organized by party members. He contributed money to leftist causes through Communist Front organizations. He attended meetings at the Berkeley Faculty Club, where party literature circulated. He'd been romantically involved with Jean Tatlock, a psychiatrist and party member. His brother Frank was an actual Communist Party member. His wife, Catherine Kitty Oppenheimer, was a biologist whose former husband had died fighting for the communists in Spain. The FBI had opened a file on Oppenheimer in the late 1930s. By 1942, that file was substantial, documenting associations and activities that would disqualify him from any security clearance under normal procedures. Army counterintelligence reviewed Oppenheimer's file and recommended denial. They saw a security nightmare, a man with access to America's most secret weapon program who'd spent years in communist circles. They pointed out that party members followed orders from Moscow. They noted that the Soviet Union was technically America's ally, but could become an adversary after the war. Giving Oppenheimer clearance meant risking leaks to Soviet intelligence. The recommendation was clear: find someone else. But Groves overruled them. He'd decided Oppenheimer was essential, and Groves didn't reconsider decisions once made. He told the security officers they could monitor Oppenheimer, tap his phones, read his mail, follow him, whatever they needed to ensure loyalty. But Oppenheimer would lead the laboratory. It was, in retrospect, a decision that haunted both men. The security concerns were validated in December 1942, when Oppenheimer told military intelligence about an approach from Soviet agents. A friend, Håkan Chevalier, had mentioned during a party at Oppenheimer's house that contacts existed who could pass information to the Soviet Union. The approach had been indirect, casual, easily dismissed. Oppenheimer claimed he'd rejected it immediately. But when interrogated months later, his story changed. First, he said the approach had come through Chevalier. Then he said it had involved others. Then he couldn't remember details clearly. The inconsistencies terrified security officers. Was Oppenheimer lying to protect friends? Was he lying about what he'd told the Soviets? Or was he simply a poor liar, confused under pressure, innocent but incompetent at counterintelligence? No one knew. The incident, later called the Chevalier Affair, would be used against Oppenheimer in 1954 when his security clearance was revoked in a hearing that destroyed his reputation. But in 1942, Groves accepted the risks because the alternatives were worse. Ernest Lawrence was too valuable running the electromagnetic separation work at Berkeley. Enrico Fermi was too important to risk. He was directing reactor experiments in Chicago, and if something went wrong in New Mexico, Fermi had to be available to fix it. Arthur Compton was coordinating the entire metallurgical laboratory effort. Harold Urey was managing gaseous diffusion research. Every qualified scientist had crucial work already. Oppenheimer was the only one who could be spared to run the weapons laboratory full-time, More importantly, Oppenheimer wanted the job. He understood its importance. He believed, despite his lack of administrative experience, that he could do it. And Groves, who valued confidence over credentials, believed him. The tragedy in Oppenheimer's personal life added complexity to the security assessment. Jean Tatlock, his former girlfriend, remained in his life despite his marriage to Kitty. She struggled with depression, and Oppenheimer still cared about her. In June 1943, while the Los Alamos laboratory was being established, Oppenheimer traveled to San Francisco and spent the night at Tatlock's apartment. Security agents followed him and documented everything. On January 4, 1944, Jean Tatlock was found dead in her San Francisco apartment, drowned in the bathtub. The official ruling was suicide. She'd attempted suicide before. She'd been in psychiatric treatment. She'd written depressed letters. But she was a Communist Party member, and Oppenheimer was running America's atomic bomb program. Questions lingered, unanswered and unanswerable. Was it really suicide, or had Soviet intelligence silenced someone who knew too much about Oppenheimer's background? The FBI investigated and found no evidence of foul play. But the timing was haunting. Despite everything, the communist associations, the security concerns, the personal tragedy, Oppenheimer threw himself into building the laboratory. He worked with Groves to select the site, Los Alamos, a former boys' school on a mesa in northern New Mexico. He recruited scientists, persuading reluctant physicists to disappear into the desert to work on secret weapons. He structured the laboratory to encourage collaboration, breaking with compartmentalization norms that Groves preferred. He organized seminars where scientists from different divisions shared results. He created a culture of intellectual openness within a fortress of security. It was a delicate balance, constantly negotiated with Groves, who wanted rigid secrecy, and the scientists, who wanted academic freedom. Oppenheimer navigated between them, translating military demands into scientific language and scientific needs into military terms. The administrative burden was crushing. Oppenheimer had to manage not just science, but logistics, housing, security, personnel conflicts, supply chains, and political pressures. He had to satisfy Groves's demands for progress while keeping his scientists motivated. He had to balance theoretical work with engineering deadlines. He had to make decisions about priorities when every problem seemed urgent. He did all this while chain-smoking, working 18-hour days, losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. Friends worried about his health. Kitty worried about his obsession. Groves worried he'd worked too hard and too long. But Oppenheimer drove forward, sustained by belief in the mission and fear of failure. He'd taken responsibility for building a weapon that could end the war. He'd accepted the burden of leadership. He couldn't stop until it was finished. What none of them fully understood, not Groves, not Oppenheimer, not the scientists streaming to Los Alamos, was how much the project would cost them personally. Oppenheimer would become famous, then infamous, celebrated, then persecuted. His communist associations, overlooked in wartime necessity, would be weaponized against him in the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s. His testimony about the Chevalier affair, confused and contradictory, would be used to strip his security clearance and destroy his influence. He would become a symbol of the scientist who regretted his creation, who quoted Hindu scripture about becoming death, destroyer of worlds. But that was later. In October 1942, walking across Berkeley campus with Groves, Oppenheimer was simply a physicist being offered the most important scientific project in history. He said yes without hesitation, without fully understanding what that yes would cost. And with that decision, the Manhattan Project gained the leader who would make it succeed, brilliantly and terribly, in ways that still echo through history. December 1943, Eastern Tennessee. A construction worker stepped off a bus into mud. Mud covered the roads, the construction sites, the temporary housing. Rain had turned the entire valley into a quagmire, but work didn't stop. Around him, thousands of other workers swarmed across what had been farmland months before. They were building something enormous, massive industrial buildings, miles of pipe, electrical infrastructure, on a scale the worker couldn't comprehend. When he asked what they were building, his supervisor told him not to ask questions. When he looked for the town on a map, he couldn't find it. The place didn't officially exist. It had a name, Oak Ridge, but no postal address, no census record, no legal status. It was a secret, hidden in plain sight, growing faster than any town in American history. By the end of the war, 75,000 people would live there, working at jobs they didn't understand, building weapons they'd never heard of. The scale of Oak Ridge defied comprehension. The construction project consumed resources at a rate that drew attention even in wartime. At peak operations, the plants at Oak Ridge used 1/7 of all electrical power generated in the United States. 1/7. To put that in perspective, a secret city in Tennessee consumed more electricity than all of New York City or all of Los Angeles. The power came from Tennessee Valley Authority dams, whose massive generators had been built during the Depression for rural electrification. Now they fed uranium enrichment plants operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, running processes so energy-intensive they would have been economically impossible in peacetime. Groves had chosen this site precisely because the TVA could provide power at scale. Without it, the electromagnetic and gaseous diffusion plants couldn't function. The main facility, K-25, was the largest building under one roof in the world at the time. It covered 42 acres, nearly 2 million square feet of floor space. The building was shaped like a giant U, half a mile long. Inside, thousands of miles of pipes carried uranium hexafluoride gas through barriers thinner than human hair. The gaseous diffusion process depended on those barriers. Uranium-235, being slightly lighter than uranium-238, would pass through the barriers fractionally faster. After thousands of stages, each enriching the gas by a tiny amount, weapons-grade uranium would emerge. But the process was finicky, temperamental, prone to failure. The barriers clogged, the pumps failed. Uranium hexafluoride corroded pipes. Workers fixed problems without knowing what the machines did. They followed procedures, met quotas, collected paychecks. Most had no idea they were enriching uranium for atomic bombs. Y-12, the electromagnetic separation plant, presented different challenges. It used calutrons, modified cyclotrons, massive electromagnetic devices that separated uranium isotopes by mass. Each calutron contained magnets wound with thousands of pounds of copper wire. But wartime demand had created a copper shortage, threatening the entire project. Groves solved the problem with typical audacity. He borrowed silver from the United States Treasury. Not just any silver, Treasury reserves, the backing for American currency. 13,540 tons of silver were loaned to the Manhattan Project, melted down, formed into wire, and wound into magnets. The silver performed perfectly, and after the war, every ounce was returned, refined, and replaced in Treasury vaults. But for 3 years, America's atomic bomb program literally depended on its silver reserves. The Y-12 plant operated around the clock, with operators monitoring dials and adjusting settings to maximize output. The work was tedious and precise. Operators, mostly young women recruited from Tennessee and surrounding states, controlled equipment they didn't understand, watching for fluctuations in magnetic fields, temperature variations, pressure changes. They became extraordinarily skilled at jobs they couldn't describe to their families. One famous story tells of operators who improved output by making subtle adjustments based on intuition, only to have efficiency drop when PhDs from Berkeley tried to optimize the process. The operators understood their machines better than the scientists who designed them. When management reinstated the operators' methods, output recovered. It was a humbling lesson about the gap between theory and practice. 1,200 miles west, in a desert region of Washington state, an even more ambitious construction project was underway. Hanford Engineer Works would produce plutonium-239, a synthetic element that didn't exist in nature. The site covered 600 square miles of sagebrush desert along the Columbia River. In early 1943, it had been home to 3 small farming communities: Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland. The Army condemned the land, forced 1,500 residents to evacuate with 30 days' notice, and bulldozed the towns. Families who'd farmed the land for generations lost homes, orchards, livelihoods. They were told only that the land was needed for war production. No compensation could replace what they'd lost. Hanford's construction workforce peaked at 45,000, the largest concentration of construction workers ever assembled at that point. They built 3 nuclear reactors along the river, designated B, D, and F, each capable of producing plutonium by irradiating uranium fuel rods. They built chemical separation plants where plutonium would be extracted from intensely radioactive fuel rods, using processes never tested at scale. They built entire infrastructure networks: roads, railroads, power lines, water treatment plants. The work was dangerous. Construction accidents killed dozens. Radioactive contamination, poorly understood at the time, exposed workers to doses that would cause cancers decades later. The Columbia River, used for cooling the reactors, received radioactive discharge that contaminated fish and irrigation systems downstream. None of this was known to workers or local populations. Safety standards were primitive because the hazards were unprecedented. The B reactor, Hanford's first plutonium production reactor, was a marvel of engineering. It contained 2,004 aluminum tubes running through a graphite core. Uranium slugs loaded into the tubes would be bombarded by neutrons, converting uranium-238 into plutonium-239. The reactor would run continuously, producing irradiated fuel rods that would be cooled, then transported to chemical separation plants. Designing the reactor had required solving problems no one had encountered before. How do you cool a sustained chain reaction? How do you shield workers from lethal radiation? How do you extract fuel rods without exposing anyone to fatal doses? Enrico Fermi and his team designed solutions based on calculations, experiments, and educated guesses. They wouldn't know if it worked until they tried. The third city, Los Alamos, was different in character from Oak Ridge and Hanford. It wasn't an industrial site, it was a laboratory, hidden on a mesa in the Yemis Mountains of northern New Mexico. Before the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos had been a boys' school, the Los Alamos Ranch School, where wealthy families sent their sons for outdoor education. Oppenheimer had visited the area years earlier and remembered its isolation and beauty. When Groves asked for site recommendations, Oppenheimer suggested Los Alamos. Groves inspected it in November 1942, approved immediately, and the Army seized the property. The school closed. The buildings became offices and laboratories. Construction crews built housing, technical areas, fences, guard towers. By spring 1943, the first scientists were arriving. Los Alamos existed as a legal fiction. Its address was Post Office Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Scientists and their families arrived at 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe, where Dorothy McKibben ran a front office. She registered new arrivals, checked their credentials, and sent them up the winding road to the mesa. Once there, they entered a world behind fences and checkpoints, a city that didn't appear on any map. Babies born at Los Alamos had no official birthplace. Their birth certificates listed only the P.O. box. Residents couldn't tell families where they lived. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Movement off the mesa required permission. It was a prison for some, a paradise for others, and home to the most brilliant scientific community ever assembled in one place. Altogether, the three cities represented an industrial and scientific effort unprecedented in human history. Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos employed 130,000 people at peak. They consumed resources at rates that strained even America's vast wartime production capacity. They cost $2 billion, equivalent to roughly $30 billion in today's currency, and more than America had initially budgeted for the entire Manhattan Project. The money bought industrial plants, nuclear reactors, laboratories, housing for tens of thousands, infrastructure networks, and the expertise to run it all. It bought secrecy on a scale that seems impossible in retrospect. Tens of thousands of people working on a project most knew nothing about, keeping secrets their families never learned. The security apparatus required to maintain that secrecy was itself vast. Military intelligence officers screened every worker. Sensors read outgoing mail. Investigators followed up on loose talk. Informants reported suspicious conversations. Compartmentalization meant workers knew only their specific tasks, never the larger picture. At Oak Ridge, workers might spend years operating equipment without learning they were enriching uranium. At Hanford, workers might extract plutonium from fuel rods without understanding what plutonium was or why it mattered. Only at Los Alamos did scientists see the full picture. And even there, Groves tried to compartmentalize until Oppenheimer insisted on open collaboration within the laboratory. The system worked remarkably. The Axis powers never learned about the Manhattan Project. Japan had no idea atomic bombs were coming. Germany's intelligence services missed the largest industrial project in America. Only Soviet spies, operating inside the project itself, knew the truth. But that knowledge wouldn't help the Axis. By the time Soviet intelligence understood what America was building, it was too late. The three cities, Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, represented different approaches to the same problem, producing fissile material and designing weapons to use it. Oak Ridge enriched uranium through electromagnetic and gaseous diffusion. Hanford produced plutonium through nuclear reactors and chemical separation. Los Alamos designed the bombs, three parallel paths to the same goal, pursued simultaneously because no one knew which would succeed. In a conventional project, this redundancy would be waste. In the Manhattan Project, it was insurance against failure. If one method failed, others might succeed. If one city's production faltered, others continued. The redundancy came with enormous costs, in money, resources, and human labor. But the costs were justified by the stakes. If the Manhattan Project failed to deliver a weapon before Japan could be invaded, 1 million American casualties were projected. If Germany built a bomb first, the war could be lost. Those possibilities made any cost seem acceptable, any risk worth taking. So, the three cities rose from farmland, desert, and mesa, built in frantic haste by people who mostly didn't know what they were building. They worked because they were told their work mattered. They endured secrecy, isolation, censorship, and surveillance because they believed the war demanded it. Most never learned the full truth until mushroom clouds bloomed over Japan. Then they understood what their labor had created. And for many, understanding brought pride mixed with horror. January 1944, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant powered up for the first time at full scale. Engineers watched nervously as massive calutrons hummed to life, their silver-wound magnets generating fields strong enough to separate uranium isotopes by mass. For months, they'd been debugging equipment, fixing leaks, replacing failed components. Now, finally, the plant was operational. The first run produced exactly what they had hoped for: uranium enriched to higher concentrations than ever before achieved. The quantity was measured in grams. They needed kilograms. But it worked, proof that electromagnetic separation could enrich uranium to weapons grade. In the control room, operators monitored dials and adjusted settings, unaware they were operating the most expensive scientific instruments ever built. Each calutron cost more than a battleship. The plant contained hundreds of them. And this was just one of 3 methods being pursued simultaneously to produce fissile material for atomic bombs. The challenge facing the Manhattan Project was fundamental. Natural uranium consisted of 99.3%, uranium-238, and only 0.7%, uranium-235. But only uranium-235 would sustain the chain reaction needed for a bomb. To build a weapon, they had to separate those isotopes, atoms that were chemically identical but differed by 3 neutrons in mass. It was like sorting grains of sand from slightly lighter grains of sand, 1 grain at a time, until you'd accumulated enough to matter. No industrial process existed to do this. The Manhattan Project had to invent 3 different methods simultaneously, build them at industrial scale, and make them work, all while racing an unknown deadline against enemies whose progress remained mysterious. Ernest Lawrence's electromagnetic separation method, used at Y-12, was conceptually simple but murderously difficult in practice. It worked like a mass spectrometer scaled up to factory size. Uranium hexafluoride gas was ionized, accelerating charged particles through a magnetic field. The lighter uranium-235 ions curved slightly more than the heavier uranium-238 ions, separating them enough to collect at different points. Lawrence had demonstrated the principle with small cyclotrons at Berkeley. Scaling it up to produce kilograms meant building racetracks of calutrons, each containing tons of copper, or silver when copper ran short, in electromagnetic coils. The early runs were disasters. Calutrons vibrated loose from their moorings, vacuum seals failed, ion sources burned out. The plant consumed vast amounts of electricity and produced microscopic amounts of enriched uranium. But the operators, mostly young women hired locally and trained to watch dials, developed intuitions that PhDs couldn't match. They learned to hear when equipment was operating correctly, to sense variations in magnetic field strength, to make tiny adjustments that optimized output. One operator became famous for consistently exceeding production targets, while trained physicists struggled. When scientists tried to improve her process with calculations, efficiency dropped. They went back to her methods, humbled. It illustrated a truth about industrial-scale physics. Theory and practice diverged enormously. What worked in laboratory demonstrations failed in factory conditions. What seemed inefficient by calculation proved optimal in reality. The gap between knowing and doing was where the Manhattan Project succeeded or failed. The second method, gaseous diffusion, was even more audacious. It depended on a subtle principle. Lighter molecules moved slightly faster than heavier molecules. Uranium hexafluoride gas containing uranium-235 would diffuse through porous barriers fractionally faster than gas containing uranium-238. After thousands of stages, each enriching the gas by a tiny percentage, weapons-grade uranium would emerge. The K-25 plant at Oak Ridge was built to house this process, but building it required solving problems that had never been encountered. The barriers had to have pores smaller than 300,000ths of an inch, holes so small that manufacturing them required inventing new techniques. The gas was corrosive, attacking any material it contacted. The pipes had to be perfectly sealed. Any leak would contaminate the cascade and ruin months of work. Engineers at Columbia University, working under Harold Urey, developed barrier materials that could withstand uranium hexafluoride while maintaining microscopic porosity. They tested dozens of materials, rejecting most, refining a few. The manufacturing process was delicate. Nickel powder was compressed, sintered, and tested until it achieved the right balance of strength and permeability. Thousands of these barriers were needed for the K-25 cascade, each one a small technological marvel, each one critical to the plant's function. If even a small percentage failed, the entire cascade would be compromised. The plant began operations in early 1945 and immediately encountered problems. Leaks appeared in unexpected places. The compressors that moved gas through the cascade vibrated and failed. Uranium hexafluoride attacked gaskets and valves. Engineers worked around the clock, fixing problems, replacing components, debugging a system too complex for any single person to fully understand. The third method, plutonium production, was different from enrichment. Plutonium-239 didn't exist in nature. It had to be created by bombarding uranium-238 with neutrons in a nuclear reactor. The neutrons would be captured by uranium nuclei, converting them through radioactive decay into neptunium-239, which would decay further into plutonium-239. The plutonium would then have to be chemically separated from intensely radioactive uranium fuel. This meant building nuclear reactors large enough to produce plutonium in quantity, and chemical separation plants to extract it. Hanford, Washington, was chosen as the site because the Columbia River could provide cooling water for the reactors. The first reactor, B reactor, was designed by Enrico Fermi's team based on their experiments with the CP1 pile under the University of Chicago football stadium. CP1 had proven that a controlled chain reaction was possible, achieving criticality on December 2, 1942. But CP1 was a small experimental reactor, producing negligible power. B reactor would operate at 250 megawatts, generating plutonium continuously while producing enough radiation to kill anyone who approached it unshielded. The engineering challenges were staggering. How do you remove heat from a reactor core without shutting down the chain reaction? How do you shield workers from neutron and gamma radiation? How do you load and unload fuel without exposing anyone to fatal doses? Fermi's team designed a water-cooled, graphite-moderated reactor. Aluminum tubes would run through a graphite core containing uranium slugs. Water would flow through the tubes, cooling the uranium while slowing neutrons to speeds optimal for fission. The irradiated fuel slugs would be pushed out remotely, dropped into cooling pools, then transported to chemical separation plants miles away. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was terrifying. The reactor went critical for the first time on September 26, 1944. Power rose steadily as operators withdrew control rods. Neutron counters clicked faster and faster, confirming that fission was occurring, sustained and controlled. Then, hours later, the reaction stopped. Power dropped to zero. The reactor had poisoned itself. No one had anticipated xenon poisoning. Xenon-135, a fission product, absorbed neutrons so efficiently that it shut down the chain reaction. As xenon decayed, the reaction restarted, only to poison itself again. Engineers panicked. Had they built a reactor that couldn't operate? Was plutonium production doomed? Then they remembered that DuPont engineers, designing the reactor, had insisted on extra capacity, additional fuel channels beyond what calculations indicated were necessary. The physicists had called it wasteful over-engineering. Now it saved the project. By loading additional uranium into the extra channels, engineers provided enough reactivity to overcome xenon poisoning. The reactor operated continuously, producing plutonium at rates that exceeded expectations. DuPont's conservative engineering, mocked during design, proved essential in operation. The chemical separation of plutonium from irradiated uranium was perhaps the most dangerous industrial process ever devised. Fuel slugs removed from the reactor were lethally radioactive, emitting enough radiation to kill in seconds. Workers couldn't approach them directly. Everything had to be done remotely, using mechanical arms and shielded facilities. The separation process involved dissolving irradiated fuel in concentrated acids, performing chemical precipitations to isolate plutonium, and purifying it through multiple stages. Glenn Seaborg, who discovered plutonium at Berkeley, had worked out the chemistry using microscopic quantities. Scaling that to industrial production meant handling tons of intensely radioactive material using techniques that had never been tested at scale. The T-plant at Hanford, designed for this purpose, was a concrete canyon with thick walls and remote handling equipment. Workers operated cranes and manipulators from behind thick shielding, watching through periscopes, extracting plutonium from materials they couldn't safely approach. By mid-1945, all three methods were producing results. Y-12's electromagnetic separation and G-25's gaseous diffusion were enriching uranium, combining their outputs to reach weapons-grade concentration. Hanford's reactors were producing plutonium in quantities sufficient for weapons. The parallel approaches, 3 different paths to fissile material, had succeeded. It had cost $2 billion, employed tens of thousands of workers, consumed enormous amounts of electrical power, and required inventing new technologies across multiple disciplines. But it worked. The impossible had been made possible through industrial audacity, scientific brilliance, and relentless engineering. Oak Ridge would produce enough uranium-235 for one gun-type bomb. Hanford would produce enough plutonium for multiple implosion-type bombs. The question now was whether Los Alamos could design weapons that would actually detonate. All the enriched uranium and plutonium in the world were useless if the bombs didn't work. That challenge, turning fissile material into functional weapons, would push physics and engineering to their absolute limits, requiring solutions to problems no one had solved before. March 1943, Santa Fe, New Mexico. A young physicist and his pregnant wife arrived at 109 East Palace Avenue, exhausted from cross-country travel. They had been told to report to this address and nothing more. Inside, they met Dorothy McKibben, a gracious woman who checked their names against a list, smiled, and told them a car would take them up to the hill. Up where? The physicist asked what he'd be working on. McKibben's smile didn't waver. You'll find out when you arrive. The car wound through pinon-covered foothills, climbing switchbacks toward the Yemez Mountains. After an hour, they reached a checkpoint. Armed guards, barbed wire, a gate that swung open to reveal a mesa-top settlement of wooden buildings, muddy roads, and stunning views. Welcome to Los Alamos, the guard said. Your new home. The physicist looked around at the hastily constructed buildings, the dirt streets, the isolation. He wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Los Alamos in 1943 was part laboratory, part frontier town, part prison camp. The site had been chosen for its isolation, far from cities, surrounded by federal land, accessible by a single road that could be easily controlled. Before the Manhattan Project, it had been the Los Alamos Ranch School, where wealthy families sent boys for outdoor education. The school's buildings became offices and dormettes. Construction crews built technical areas, housing units, laboratories, and fences. Lots of fences. The mesa was surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by military police. Passes were required to leave. Civilians, scientists and their families, lived under military authority in what was technically an army post. The address for all mail was Post Office Box 1663, Santa Fe. Babies born on the mesa had P.O. Box 1663 listed as their birthplace. Officially, the town didn't exist. The culture that developed at Los Alamos was unlike anything in military or academic history. Oppenheimer had insisted, over Groves's objections, that scientists share information across divisions. Compartmentalization, Groves's preferred security method, would slow research and stifle innovation. So, Oppenheimer organized weekly colloquia where scientists from theoretical, experimental, engineering, and chemistry divisions presented their work. Everyone attended. Everyone asked questions. Graduate students challenged Nobel laureates. Ideas crossed disciplinary boundaries. It was intellectually exhilarating and, from a security standpoint, terrifying. Every person at those meetings knew the entire scope of the atomic bomb project. If any of them were spies, or if any were captured by enemies, the consequences would be catastrophic. But Oppenheimer's approach worked. The open collaboration accelerated problem-solving in ways compartmentalization never could. When theoretical physicists discovered a problem with bomb design, experimentalists immediately began testing solutions. When chemists developed new explosive compositions, engineers adapted them to production. When metallurgists struggled with plutonium's bizarre properties, theorists helped explain what was happening at the atomic level. The laboratory functioned as a unified organism, all parts communicating, all working toward the same goal. It helped that most of the scientists were young. The median age was around 25, young enough to believe impossible problems could be solved, young enough to work 18-hour days without breaking, young enough to thrive in the intense pressure cooker environment Oppenheimer created. Daily life mixed scientific urgency with domestic normalcy in surreal combinations. Scientists worked on bomb designs all day, then came home to families living in army housing. Wives shopped at a single commissary using scrip. No real currency was allowed on the mesa. Children played in dirt streets unaware their fathers were building weapons that could obliterate cities. Social life revolved around parties where physicists drank, danced, and argued about quantum mechanics or politics. Security restrictions created odd situations. At parties, scientists couldn't discuss their work, so they talked about everything else: philosophy, literature, music. The censors read all outgoing mail, occasionally objecting to innocent phrases that sounded suspicious. One wife wrote about the new baby and had her letter delayed because censors thought baby was code for something related to the bomb project. Richard Feynman became legendary for testing security measures. He picked locks on filing cabinets containing classified documents, leaving notes that said, "Guess who?" He discovered that censors weren't checking incoming mail, only outgoing, so he arranged for friends to send him letters in code. which he then translated and left on officials' desks to prove the vulnerability. He cracked safes in colleagues' offices for fun, demonstrating that the security protecting atomic secrets was penetrable. Military security officers were furious. Oppenheimer was amused. Feynman's pranks illustrated a deeper truth. Its security at Los Alamos depended less on locks and procedures than on the integrity of the people working there. If someone wanted to steal secrets, no amount of barbed wire would stop them. The real security was trust. Trust that scientists understood the stakes and wouldn't betray the project. Enrico Fermi, one of the world's most famous physicists, took nightly walks around the mesa, calculating in his head. Military guards followed him everywhere, under orders to prevent contact with anyone outside the project. Fermi found it hilarious. He'd escaped fascist Italy because he valued freedom, and now he lived under armed surveillance in democratic America. But he understood the necessity. When scientists at Los Alamos felt constrained by security, Fermi reminded them that they were free to leave any time. But if they stayed, they'd agreed to the rules. Most stayed. The work was too important, too intellectually challenging, too connected to winning the war. They tolerated surveillance, censorship, and isolation because they believed their work would save lives by ending the conflict faster. The isolation affected families differently. Some wives thrived in the tight-knit community, forming friendships that lasted decades. Others struggled with confinement, boredom, and the secrecy that prevented their husbands from discussing work. Children adapted easily. For them, Los Alamos was an adventure, a place where everyone's father did mysterious, important work, and the mountains provided endless exploration. But teenagers chafed at restrictions. They couldn't explain to pen pals where they lived. They couldn't invite friends from Santa Fe to visit. They lived in a secret town with a secret purpose, and the secrecy felt stifling. Some families left Los Alamos within months, unable to tolerate the conditions. Others stayed for the duration, adapting to a life where normalcy and abnormality coexisted in uneasy balance. The technical area, where actual bomb design occurred, was separated from residential areas by fences and checkpoints. Scientists carried badges color-coded by clearance level. White badges allowed access everywhere. Blue badges were restricted to specific buildings. Red badges meant limited access, usually for machinists and technicians who fabricated components without knowing their purpose. Inside the technical area, laboratories buzzed with activity. Theorists filled blackboards with equations. Experimentalists assembled test devices. Chemists analyzed explosive compositions. Metallurgists studied plutonium, which behaved unlike any other metal, hard and brittle in one crystalline phase, soft and malleable in another. Every division faced problems that had never been encountered, requiring solutions that had never been tried. The sense of urgency never lifted. Everyone at Los Alamos knew that American soldiers were fighting and dying in Europe and the Pacific. They knew that every month of delay meant more casualties. They knew, or believed, that German scientists might be working on the same weapon, and that whoever finished first would determine the war's outcome. That knowledge drove them. When experiments failed, they worked longer hours. When calculations revealed new problems, they attacked them immediately. When personal conflicts arose, Oppenheimer mediated, keeping everyone focused on the mission. He was everywhere, attending seminars, visiting laboratories, talking with technicians, reassuring administrators, fighting with Groves over resources. He held the laboratory together through force of personality and relentless attention. Scientists who doubted his administrative abilities came to see him as indispensable. He'd transformed from a theoretical physicist into a leader, and in doing so, he'd created a community unlike any before or since. By 1945, Los Alamos had grown from a boys' school into a city of 6,000 people, all dedicated to a single purpose: building atomic bombs. The transformation was complete. What had been a remote mesa in New Mexico was now the most important scientific facility in the world, the place where theory became hardware, where calculations became weapons, where the atomic age was being born. The scientists working there, the theorists, experimentalists, engineers, chemists, and technicians, had become a community bound by secrecy, urgency, and shared purpose. They couldn't tell their families what they did. They couldn't explain to outsiders why it mattered. But among themselves, they knew. They were building something unprecedented, something that could end the war, something that would change history. The weight of that knowledge affected everyone differently. Some thrived under the pressure, some broke under it. All of them, in different ways, would carry Los Alamos with them for the rest of their lives, the memory of the laboratory at the end of the world, where they did impossible work in impossible conditions, and somehow, against all odds, succeeded. June 2nd, 1945, Santa Fe, New Mexico. A soft-spoken British physicist named Klaus Fuchs walked down a quiet street toward a prearranged meeting point. He carried a folder containing some of the most sensitive documents in human history. Complete specifications for the plutonium implosion bomb being developed at Los Alamos. Fuchs had worked on the Manhattan Project since 1944, recruited from British nuclear research as part of the UK's contribution to the Allied bomb effort. He had full security clearance. He attended classified seminars. He knew everything. And for over a year, he'd been photographing documents and passing them to Soviet intelligence. His contact, a man named Harry Gold, waited at the corner. They exchanged recognition signals. Fuchs handed over the folder. Gold gave him an envelope containing payment. The meeting lasted 2 minutes. Then they separated, disappearing into the Santa Fe evening. Neither suspected they had been followed. Neither imagined their actions would accelerate Soviet nuclear weapons development by years and help trigger the Cold War arms race. The story of Soviet espionage against the Manhattan Project began in ideology and ended in geopolitics. Klaus Fuchs was a committed communist who'd fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, finding refuge in Britain. He joined the Communist Party in Germany before fleeing and remained ideologically committed afterward. When Britain recruited him for nuclear research, security screening was minimal. He was an anti-fascist refugee with excellent scientific credentials. No one investigated his political background thoroughly. When the British team joined the Manhattan Project, Fuchs came with them, and American security accepted British vouching. It was a catastrophic oversight. From his arrival at Los Alamos in August 1944 until his arrest in February 1950, Fuchs systematically betrayed atomic secrets to Moscow. What Fuchs provided was devastating in scope and detail. He gave the Soviets theoretical calculations about bomb design, explaining how implosion compression worked. He provided exact specifications for the plutonium core and the high explosive lens systems surrounding it. He described the initiator, the polonium-beryllium device that triggered the chain reaction. He explained the difficulties Los Alamos scientists had encountered and the solutions they had developed. Soviet scientists working on their own bomb program could check their calculations against American data, correct their errors, and avoid dead ends. Fuchs's information saved the Soviet program between 1 and 2 years of research time. Years that could have allowed the United States to maintain its nuclear monopoly long enough to establish international controls. Instead, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949, shocking American leaders who'd assumed a 10-year technological lead. Fuchs wasn't alone. David Greenglass, a machinist at Los Alamos, was recruited by his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, to spy for the Soviet Union. Greenglass had less access than Fuchs. He worked in the technical area, but wasn't privy to high-level design meetings. Still, he provided valuable information, sketches of high-explosive lens molds, descriptions of the implosion assembly process, estimates of production schedules. His information corroborated what Fuchs provided and filled gaps in Soviet understanding. Greenglass would later testify against the Rosenbergs in the espionage trial that led to their execution in 1953. His testimony helped convict them, and his confession earned him a lighter sentence, 15 years in prison compared to the Rosenbergs' death sentences. The most remarkable Soviet spy was Theodore Hall, a 19-year-old physicist who volunteered his services without being recruited. Hall was brilliant. He'd graduated from Harvard at 18 and joined Los Alamos in early 1944. He worked in the implosion division, attending seminars where the bomb's innermost secrets were discussed. He was also an idealistic communist who believed that American nuclear monopoly would destabilize the post-war world. In late 1944, while on leave in New York, Hall walked into the Soviet consulate and offered to provide information. Soviet intelligence was initially suspicious. Was he a plant? An American counterintelligence operative? But Hall proved genuine. He provided details about the implosion design, corroborating and expanding on what Fuchs had already supplied. Hall was never caught during his lifetime. The FBI suspected him, but lacked evidence to prosecute. Venona decryptions, decoded Soviet intelligence cables, eventually revealed his identity in the 1990s, decades after the statute of limitations had expired. The scale of Soviet penetration raised a question that haunted American security officials. How did it happen? How did spies infiltrate the most secret project in American history? Part of the answer was ideological. In the 1930s and early 40s, communism attracted idealistic intellectuals who saw it as the alternative to fascism. Many scientists at Los Alamos had leftist sympathies. Not all were spies, but some were willing to share secrets with America's Soviet ally. They rationalized espionage as progressive internationalism, believing that spreading nuclear knowledge would prevent American hegemony. It was a fatal misunderstanding of Stalin's regime and Soviet intentions, but it was sincerely believed by men like Fuchs and Hall. Another part of the answer was structural. The Manhattan Project's security depended on compartmentalization, workers knowing only their specific tasks. But Oppenheimer had successfully argued for collaboration at Los Alamos, meaning scientists there had access to the full picture. That openness accelerated scientific progress but created security vulnerabilities. Anyone at Los Alamos with bad intentions could provide comprehensive intelligence to enemies. Groves had accepted this risk, betting that faster scientific progress justified weaker compartmentalization. He was right about the science. Los Alamos succeeded brilliantly, but the security cost was higher than anyone knew during the war. The Soviets learned nearly everything about the American bomb program, from spies with legitimate access to Los Alamos. The security apparatus at Los Alamos attempted to monitor everyone. The FBI and Army counterintelligence maintained surveillance on suspected leftists. They tapped phones, opened mail, followed scientists off the mesa. They compiled dossiers on political associations, recording who attended which meetings, who donated to which causes, who said what at social gatherings. Oppenheimer himself was under constant surveillance because of his pre-war communist associations. His phones were tapped, his movements were tracked, his conversations were recorded. Yet, despite all this surveillance, the spies operated successfully. Fuchs passed information for years without detection. Hall was never identified during his active espionage. Greenglass was caught only after the Rosenberg ring was rolled up through other means. The surveillance state, oppressive to those living under it, was ineffective at stopping determined spies. The irony was that Groves's compartmentalization, which Oppenheimer had fought against at Los Alamos, worked elsewhere. At Oak Ridge and Hanford, where workers knew only their specific tasks, there's no evidence of significant espionage. Soviet intelligence focused on Los Alamos because that's where the full picture existed. The openness that made Los Alamos scientifically productive made it vulnerable to penetration. This tension between scientific collaboration and security compartmentalization would define Cold War research institutions. After the war, weapons laboratories adopted stricter compartmentalization, limiting what any individual knew. Scientific progress slowed, but security improved. It was an acknowledgement that Oppenheimer's approach, however scientifically successful, had been compromised by spies who exploited the very openness that made discovery possible. The long-term consequences of Soviet espionage were profound. The information Stalin received from Los Alamos, spies accelerated Soviet bomb development, ending American nuclear monopoly in 1949 instead of the mid-1950s. That shortened timeline changed post-war diplomacy, influencing decisions about everything from the Marshall Plan to the Korean War. It helped trigger the nuclear arms race, as both superpowers pursued ever larger arsenals. It fueled the Red Scare and McCarthyism, as politicians demanded answers about how the Soviets had obtained atomic secrets so quickly. Klaus Fuchs's arrest in 1950 sparked a spy hunt that destroyed careers, ruined lives, and turned security obsessions into political weapons. Oppenheimer himself would become a victim of that paranoia in his 1954 security hearing, where his pre-war communist associations and wartime judgments about security were used to strip his clearance and humiliate him publicly. But in June 1945, as Klaus Fuchs handed documents to Harry Gold on a Santa Fe street, none of the consequences were visible yet. The war was still being fought. The bombs hadn't been tested. No one at Los Alamos knew the Soviets had comprehensive intelligence about their work. The scientists focused on technical challenges, racing to finish weapons before Japan could be invaded. Security officers watched suspected leftists without realizing the real spies operated undetected. Groves believed his compartmentalization and surveillance had prevented leaks. Truman assumed America's atomic monopoly would last years after the war. Everyone was wrong. The invisible enemy had already penetrated the project, stolen its secrets, and changed the post-war world in ways that no one, not Groves, not Oppenheimer, not Truman, had anticipated or could prevent. The spies' success meant that the atomic age would be defined not by American monopoly, but by superpower competition. Not by international control, but by nuclear arms races. Not by scientific openness, but by security paranoia. These consequences would unfold over decades, but they began with a few committed ideologues passing folders of documents to Soviet contacts in quiet corners of Santa Fe and New York. February 1945, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Engineers stared at production reports that documented systematic failure. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, supposed to produce kilogram quantities of enriched uranium, was operating at 1/10 expected capacity. Cascade stages were failing faster than they could be repaired. Leaks contaminated the gas stream. Pumps vibrated apart. Barriers clogged with impurities. Every problem, once fixed, revealed another. The plant had cost hundreds of millions of dollars and consumed vast amounts of electrical power. Yet, after months of operation, it had produced barely enough enriched uranium to coat a coin. Meanwhile, Y-12's electromagnetic separation achieved better results, but remained painfully slow. At current production rates, they might have enough uranium for one bomb by summer, if nothing else went wrong. One bomb, against an enemy that showed no inclination to surrender. The timeline crisis had been building since mid-1944. Initial projections assumed production would ramp up smoothly once facilities were operational. Reality proved otherwise. Every method, electromagnetic separation, gaseous diffusion, plutonium production, encountered problems that slowed or halted output. The Manhattan Project had bet enormous resources on industrial processes that had never been tested at scale. Laboratory demonstrations didn't translate to factory performance. What worked with milligrams failed with kilograms. Engineers spent more time troubleshooting than producing. Groves received progress reports showing curves that should have climbed steeply upward instead, staggering sideways, barely advancing. He pushed harder, demanded faster fixes, authorized unlimited overtime. But some problems couldn't be solved by working longer hours. At Hanford, plutonium production faced different challenges. The B reactor, after overcoming xenon poisoning, operated successfully through late 1944, but chemical separation, extracting plutonium from irradiated fuel, proved nightmarishly difficult. The T plant, designed for remote handling of radioactive material, suffered equipment failures and contamination incidents. Workers operated cranes and manipulators from behind thick shielding, but the equipment jammed, broke, or malfunctioned in the intense radiation environment. Fuel slugs dissolved in acid baths that corroded pipes and valves. Plutonium precipitated unpredictably, requiring endless adjustments to chemical processes. Production rates lagged behind schedules by weeks, then months. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock, fixing problems, replacing equipment, learning through trial and costly error. Meanwhile, the war ground forward with mounting casualties. By early 1945, Germany was near collapse. But Japan showed no signs of surrendering. American forces had captured Iwo Jima in brutal fighting, 7,000 Americans killed, 19,000 wounded. Okinawa would be worse. The invasion began April 1st, 1945, and would cost 12,000 American dead and 38,000 wounded before it ended in June. Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000 military and civilian combined. The fighting demonstrated what invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. Military planners projected between 1.5 million and 4 million American casualties for Operation Olympic. The invasion of Kyushu planned for November 1945, and Operation Coronet. The invasion of Honshu planned for March 1946. Casualty estimates varied, but all were horrifying. The Japanese military, meanwhile, prepared for final resistance. The doctrine of the glorious death of the 100 million called for every Japanese citizen to resist invasion. The government distributed weapons, trained civilians in bamboo spear tactics, and prepared to mobilize 28 million people for homeland defense. Kamikaze attacks increased, suicide aircraft deliberately crashing into American ships. At Okinawa, over 1,900 kamikaze sorties sank 36 American ships and damaged hundreds more. If this was the resistance at Okinawa, what would invasion of the main islands bring? American planners factored in fanatical resistance, civilian casualties in the millions, and a war extending into 1946 or beyond. Against this backdrop, the Manhattan Project's production problems took on desperate urgency. If the bombs weren't ready before November, the invasion would proceed without them. If the bombs weren't ready before spring 1946, hundreds of thousands of Americans would die in fighting that might have been avoided. Groves understood this calculus. He pushed production facilities beyond safe limits, accepted risks that peacetime operations would never tolerate, and authorized expenditures without regard to cost. Money meant nothing if the weapons arrived too late. Speed was everything. Every day of delay translated to American casualties in Pacific battles and, potentially, hundreds of thousands more in the invasion. By April 1945, production began stabilizing. Y-12's operators, through hard-won experience, improved electromagnetic separation efficiency. The plant produced enriched uranium in quantities that, while still disappointing, approached usable levels. K-25, after months of debugging, began contributing to enrichment, feeding its output into Y-12 for final processing. Combined, the two plants could produce enough uranium-235 for a single gun-type bomb by July or August. It wasn't much, but it was enough. At Hanford, plutonium production accelerated as chemical separation problems were solved through brutal persistence. By May, the site had accumulated enough plutonium for multiple bombs, assuming the implosion design worked. That assumption, that implosion would work, was enormous and unproven. The uranium gun-type bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was considered so reliable that Los Alamos planned to use it without testing. The design was simple. Shoot one piece of uranium into another, creating critical mass and triggering a chain reaction. It had to work. But plutonium couldn't use the gun design because its spontaneous fission rate would cause pre-detonation. Plutonium required implosion. Surrounding a plutonium core with high explosives that, when detonated simultaneously, would compress the core to supercriticality. The implosion design was complex, unproven, and the only way to use the plutonium that Hanford was producing. If implosion failed, months of production would be wasted, and the Manhattan Project would have one uranium bomb against an enemy that required more than one bomb to force surrender. Los Alamos scientists understood the stakes. They scheduled a full-scale test, Trinity, for July 1945 in the New Mexico desert. Trinity would prove whether implosion worked, whether plutonium bombs were viable, whether years of theoretical calculations translated to explosive reality. The test couldn't happen until enough plutonium had been produced, and production couldn't be accelerated beyond what Hanford's facilities could manage. Everything converged on a timeline that left no margin for error. Finish production by July, test the implosion design, deploy the bombs by August if the test succeeded. Any delay, any failure, and the weapons would arrive too late to affect invasion planning. Throughout this period, one question haunted everyone involved. Were they too late already? German surrender on May 8, 1945, had removed one justification for the Manhattan Project, preventing Hitler from getting atomic bombs. But Japan remained at war, and the Pacific fighting showed no signs of ending. Some scientists, particularly at the metallurgical laboratory in Chicago, began questioning whether atomic bombs were necessary. Leo Szilard, who'd started the project with his letter to Einstein, now opposed using the bombs against Japan. He circulated petitions arguing for demonstration rather than surprise attack. But at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, where the actual production occurred, there was less debate and more focus on finishing. The arguments about use could wait. First, they had to produce enough material and prove the weapons worked. Without production, there was nothing to argue about. So engineers pushed through the crisis, fixed the problems, and delivered, barely just in time, the fissile material that would make Trinity possible and Hiroshima inevitable. July 1944, Anchor Ranch, south of Los Alamos. Seth Nettermeyer stood in the New Mexico sun, watching an experiment explode wrong. He'd arranged cylinders of high explosive around metal tubes, hoping to compress them symmetrically. The detonation produced exactly what he'd feared: asymmetric collapse. The metal squirted out sideways instead of compressing inward. It was a disaster, but a predictable one. For over a year, Nettermeyer had been telling anyone who'd listen that implosion, squeezing plutonium to supercritical density using conventional explosives, was theoretically possible but practically horrifying. The tolerances required were absurd. The timing had to be perfect. Any asymmetry would cause the plutonium to deform rather than compress, preventing the chain reaction that would produce an atomic explosion. And experiment after experiment demonstrated that achieving symmetry was nearly impossible. The plutonium problem had emerged gradually through 1943 and early 44. Initially, Los Alamos scientists assumed plutonium could use a gun-type design like uranium, shoot one piece into another, achieve critical mass, trigger the bomb. It was simple, reliable, and based on well-understood ballistics. But as Hanford began producing plutonium samples, chemists at Los Alamos discovered something terrifying. Plutonium had a much higher spontaneous fission rate than uranium-235. Neutrons were constantly being emitted from plutonium nuclei, even without external triggers. In a gun-type design, those stray neutrons would initiate the chain reaction prematurely, before the pieces fully came together. The result would be a fizzle, a partial detonation that scattered plutonium without producing a significant nuclear explosion. The gun design, elegant for uranium, was useless for plutonium. That left implosion as the only option, and implosion was a nightmare. The concept was simple: surround a plutonium core with high explosives arranged in a sphere. Detonate all the explosives simultaneously, creating a shock wave that compresses the plutonium inward from all directions. If the compression is symmetric and fast enough, the plutonium core will be squeezed to supercritical density before spontaneous fission can cause pre-detonation. The resulting chain reaction releases enormous energy in a fraction of a microsecond. But simple in concept and possible in practice were separated by chasms of engineering difficulty. Nettermeyer's experiments at Anchor Ranch demonstrated those difficulties with depressing consistency. Every test showed asymmetric collapse, metal squirting out, symmetry failing. The problem was that high explosives don't naturally produce symmetric shock waves. Explosives detonate faster at some points than others. Small variations in composition, temperature, or geometry create asymmetries that amplify during implosion. By the time the shock wave reaches the plutonium core, those tiny variations have grown into catastrophic asymmetries. The core deforms into oblong shapes, fails to reach critical density, and doesn't explode. Nettermeyer knew this intellectually, but seeing it in experiment after experiment was demoralizing. Other scientists at Los Alamos began questioning whether implosion was achievable. Some suggested abandoning plutonium entirely and focusing solely on uranium bombs. But that would waste Hanford's production and leave the Manhattan Project with a single weapon, nowhere near enough to force Japanese surrender. The solution came from an unlikely source, John von Neumann, a mathematician who'd worked on shaped charges for anti-tank weapons. Von Neumann had studied how explosives could be shaped to focus blast effects in specific directions. He realized the same principles could create symmetric implosion. Instead of using uniform explosives, use explosive lenses. Blocks of different explosive compositions arranged to bend shock waves, just as glass lenses bend light. Fast detonating explosives would create the initial shock. Slower explosives would shape that shock into a symmetric inward-moving wave. Multiple lenses, arranged in a sphere around the plutonium core, could theoretically produce the symmetry required for implosion. The idea was brilliant. Implementation was hellish. Creating explosive lenses required casting blocks of experimental explosives with precise shapes, compositions, and interfaces. The fast explosive, designated Composition B, was TNT and RDX, mixed to specific ratios. The slow explosive, baritol, was barium nitrate and TNT. Each lens had to be cast individually, machined to tolerances of thousandths of an inch, and assembled into a sphere with perfect alignment. Any imperfection, a void in the casting, a crack during cooling, misalignment during assembly, would destroy symmetry and cause the implosion to fail. And they needed 32 lenses per bomb, each one different, each one critical. George Kistiakowsky, recruited from explosives research at the National Defense Research Committee, took over the experimental program from Nettermeyer. Kistiakowsky was a chemist who understood explosives at the molecular level, but also possessed the engineering sensibility to scale laboratory demonstrations to functional weapons. He brought discipline, organization, and relentless experimentation to the implosion program. Where Nettermeyer had been cautious and theoretical, Kistiakowsky was bold and empirical. He ran hundreds of tests, trying different explosive compositions, shapes, and arrangements. He measured symmetry using X-ray photography, capturing split-second images of collapsing metal spheres. Slowly, through trial and error and incremental improvement, the explosive lens design converged on something that worked. But testing explosive lenses required more than just high-speed photography. They needed to measure whether the lenses actually compressed materials to the densities required for plutonium criticality. That meant building specialized diagnostics, Rala tests, named for the radioactive lanthanum sources they used. In these tests, an explosive assembly would compress a radioactive source while X-rays captured the implosion dynamics. The X-ray images revealed whether compression was symmetric and whether densities reached theoretical predictions. Each Rala test consumed expensive equipment, radioactive materials, and weeks of preparation. But they provided data that calculations couldn't, proof that implosion could work, that symmetry was achievable, that plutonium could be compressed to supercritical densities fast enough to produce a nuclear explosion. By early 1945, the implosion design had evolved from Nettermeyer's failing experiments into a sophisticated weapons system. The final design, codenamed Fat Man, used 32 explosive lenses arranged in a sphere around a plutonium core. The lenses were two different designs, 20 hexagonal lenses and 12 pentagonal lenses, assembled like a spherical soccer ball. Detonators, 64 of them, would fire simultaneously within a fraction of a microsecond, initiating the implosion. The shock wave would compress the plutonium core from the size of a grapefruit to the size of a tennis ball, increasing its density by a factor of 3. At maximum compression, a polonium-beryllium initiator at the core's center would inject neutrons, starting the chain reaction. The entire process, from detonation to nuclear explosion, would take about 10 microseconds. The technical achievement was staggering. Implosion required advancing multiple fields: explosives chemistry, precision machining, high-speed diagnostics, metallurgy, and nuclear physics, and integrating them into a functional weapon. It required solving problems no one had encountered before and achieving tolerances that many experts considered impossible. The electromagnetic separation at Oak Ridge and plutonium production at Hanford were industrial marvels. But implosion was something different. It was physics and engineering pushed to their absolute limits, achieving precision at explosive timescales, compressing matter to densities found nowhere in nature except during nuclear detonations. If it worked, and that remained a massive if until Trinity, it would prove that human beings could control nuclear forces with enough precision to build weapons. If it failed, the Manhattan Project would have wasted billions of dollars and years of effort on a plutonium program that produced nothing usable. The pressure on Los Alamos scientists working on implosion was immense. They knew that uranium production would yield only one bomb. They knew the war was killing thousands daily. They knew that forcing Japanese surrender required demonstrating overwhelming, unavoidable force, probably requiring multiple atomic bombs. Everything depended on implosion working. Nettermeyer, despite being sidelined in favor of Kistiakowsky's more aggressive approach, continued contributing to the design. Von Neumann refined the mathematical models that predicted implosion dynamics. Technicians cast explosive lenses by hand, inspecting each one for defects, knowing that a single flawed lens could doom the entire weapon. By June 1945, they had enough confidence in the design to begin assembling the Trinity Test device, but confidence based on calculations and small-scale tests wasn't certainty. Only a full-scale explosion would prove whether years of work had produced a functional weapon or an expensive failure. That test, Trinity, would either vindicate the implosion approach or condemn the Manhattan Project to having built one of the most complex industrial enterprises in history for nothing. May 21, 1946, Los Alamos, New Mexico. Louis Slotin stood in a small laboratory room, demonstrating a criticality experiment to 7 colleagues. In his hands, he held 2 hemispheres of beryllium that acted as neutron reflectors around a plutonium core, the same core that had been destined for a 3rd atomic bomb before Japan surrendered. Slotin used a screwdriver to control the gap between the hemispheres, edging them closer together while watching neutron counters for signs of criticality. His colleagues had nicknamed these experiments "tickling the dragon's tail," a recognition that they were deliberately approaching the edge of a nuclear chain reaction using nothing but hand-eye coordination and a screwdriver. At 3:20 p.m., the screwdriver slipped. The hemispheres closed. The room filled with blue light, Cherenkov radiation from air ionization. Slotin knew instantly what had happened. He tore the hemispheres apart with his bare hands, stopping the chain reaction, but exposing himself to a massive radiation dose. He'd saved his colleagues' lives and condemned himself. 9 days later, Louis Slotin died from acute radiation poisoning. The work that killed Slotin, criticality experiments with bare nuclear cores, was among the most dangerous activities at Los Alamos. But it was necessary because no one fully understood how plutonium and uranium behaved at the edge of criticality. The physics was understood theoretically. Bring enough fissile material together in the right geometry, and a self-sustaining chain reaction begins. Neutrons split uranium or plutonium atoms, releasing more neutrons that split more atoms, exponentially growing until the material explodes or melts. But theory didn't answer practical questions. What exact mass was required? How did different shapes affect criticality? What happened when you added neutron reflectors? These questions had to be answered experimentally, and experiments with critical masses of plutonium were inherently lethal. Harry Daghlian had learned that lesson in August 1945. He'd been conducting a late-night experiment, stacking tungsten carbide bricks around a plutonium core to reflect neutrons and study how close the assembly came to criticality. He was alone, a violation of safety protocols, and tired. He accidentally dropped a brick directly onto the core. The assembly went supercritical. Neutron counters screamed. Daghlian, panicking, knocked the brick off the core, stopping the reaction. But he'd stood directly next to the assembly during criticality, receiving a massive radiation dose. He died 25 days later after horrific suffering, his hands swelling, his tissue breaking down, his body destroying itself from radiation damage. He was 24 years old. The core that killed Daghlian and later killed Slotin became known as the Demon Core, a 6.2 kilogram sphere of plutonium that had been cast for the third atomic bomb. After Japan's surrender, the core was no longer needed for weapons and became available for experiments. Scientists used it to explore critical mass dynamics, measuring neutron multiplication factors as they brought reflectors closer to the core. The experiments were scientifically valuable but terrifyingly dangerous. There were no remote handling systems, no safety interlocks, no automated shutoffs. Scientists manipulated kilograms of plutonium using screwdrivers and hand tools, relying on skill and luck to avoid accidental criticality. When accidents happened, and they did, twice with the Demon Core, the consequences were fatal. Building the cores for Little Boy and Fat Man had required solving metallurgical problems no one had encountered before. Plutonium was unlike any other metal. It existed in multiple crystalline phases depending on temperature, each with different properties. At room temperature, it was brittle and difficult to machine. Heated slightly, it transformed into a softer phase that could be shaped, but was chemically reactive and prone to oxidation. It was toxic, radioactive, and pyrophoric, capable of spontaneously igniting in air if powdered. Metallurgists at Los Alamos learned through painful experience how to cast plutonium into spheres, machine them to precise dimensions, and coat them with protective layers. Every step was dangerous. Every mistake could contaminate laboratories or expose workers to radiation. Uranium-235, used in Little Boy, was more forgiving, but still challenging. Enriched uranium arrived from Oak Ridge in small batches, each carefully measured and accounted for. The Little Boy design required about 64 kilograms of uranium divided into two pieces, a bullet that would be fired into a target. Bringing those pieces together at high velocity would create a supercritical mass and trigger the chain reaction. The design was simple enough that scientists were confident it would work without testing, which was fortunate because they had only enough enriched uranium for one bomb. If Little Boy failed over Japan, there would be no second chance, no backup weapon using uranium. Everything depended on a design that had never been proven in practice. The cores themselves were surprisingly small. Critical mass for uranium-235 was about 52 kilograms in a bare sphere, roughly the size of a softball. For plutonium-239, critical mass was even smaller, about 10 kilograms, or about the size of a baseball. These modest quantities, harmless when separated, became civilization-ending weapons when brought together. The psychological impact of handling such materials was profound. Scientists joked nervously about tickling the dragon, but understood they were working with materials that could kill them in microseconds if mishandled. The blue glow that Slotin saw, Cherenkov radiation, was beautiful and deadly. Ionized air molecules radiating light as neutrons tore through them. Building the plutonium cores for Fat Man and the Trinity Test required even greater precision because implosion demanded exact geometry. The cores had to be perfectly spherical. Any deviation would introduce asymmetries during compression, potentially causing the implosion to fail. Metallurgists cast plutonium hemispheres, machined them to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and assembled them with polonium-beryllium initiators at their centers. The initiators were ingenious devices, a small sphere of polonium surrounded by beryllium, separated by gold foil. During implosion, the compression would bring polonium and beryllium into contact, triggering alpha-neutron reactions that would flood the compressed plutonium with neutrons at precisely the moment of maximum density. The timing had to be perfect. Milliseconds too early or too late would reduce the bomb's yield. The assembly process for both bombs was meticulous and nerve-wracking. At Los Alamos, technicians practiced assembling dummy bombs repeatedly, perfecting every motion. When actual fissile cores arrived, the assembly occurred under intense security and supervision. For Trinity, the plutonium core was assembled at Los Alamos, transported to the test site, and installed into the device, called the Gadget, on a steel tower. For the operational bombs, cores would be transported separately from the bomb assemblies and installed only after arrival at Tinian Island. This reduced the risk of accidental detonation during transport, but added complexity to the mission timeline. Assemblers would have to integrate the core into the bomb on Tinian under field conditions, knowing that mistakes could be fatal or could doom the mission. The risks extended beyond radiation. Plutonium's toxicity meant that any contamination, breathing plutonium dust, absorbing it through skin, could cause cancer years or decades later. Safety protocols were primitive by modern standards. Workers wore gloves and lab coats, but often handled materials in open air. Ventilation systems were basic. Monitoring equipment detected only high-level exposure, missing chronic low-level contamination. Many scientists who worked with plutonium at Los Alamos developed cancers later in life, though establishing direct causation was difficult. The long-term health costs of building atomic bombs were paid decades after the bombs themselves had been used. By July 1945, Los Alamos had produced 3 plutonium cores, one for Trinity, one for Fat Man, and the demon core that would kill Daglione and Slotin. They'd produced enough enriched uranium for Little Boy with a small surplus. It wasn't much, barely enough fissile material for 3 weapons after 3 years of effort and $2 billion. But it was enough to test the implosion design, and, if the test succeeded, enough to deploy 2 atomic bombs against Japan. The question now was whether the weapons would work. Calculations said yes. Small-scale experiments said yes. But nuclear weapons existed at the intersection of physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering. And in that intersection, small errors could cascade into catastrophic failures. The cores were ready. The explosive lenses were ready. The delivery systems were ready. Everything converged on Trinity, the test that would prove whether 3 years of desperate effort had produced functional weapons or elaborate failures. If Trinity succeeded, the atomic age would begin with a flash in the New Mexico desert. If it failed, the Manhattan Project would have created the most expensive and complex scientific failure in history, and the invasion of Japan would proceed without the weapons that might have prevented it. May 10th, 1945. Los Alamos. A dozen men sat around a conference table discussing which Japanese cities to destroy with atomic bombs. The meeting had an almost bureaucratic quality. Reports were distributed, criteria were discussed, recommendations were made, except the subject was selecting targets for weapons that would kill tens of thousands of people in seconds. The target committee included scientists from Los Alamos, military officers from Air Force Strategic Planning, and civilian advisors from the War Department. Their task was to identify cities that would maximize the atomic bomb's psychological, military, and strategic impact. They needed targets that would demonstrate overwhelming force, that would shock Japan into surrender, that would justify the Manhattan Project's enormous cost. The discussion proceeded methodically, coldly, as if selecting targets for conventional bombing raids rather than unprecedented weapons of mass destruction. What the target committee didn't seriously consider was demonstration. Some scientists, particularly at the Metallurgical Laboratory in Chicago, had proposed demonstrating the bomb in an uninhabited area or offshore to convince Japan of its power without mass casualties. The Frank Report, submitted in June by James Frank and 6 other scientists, argued that surprise use of atomic bombs on cities would spark an arms race and international condemnation. Better to demonstrate the weapon, give Japan a chance to surrender, and establish moral precedent for restraint in the atomic age. But the Target Committee and the Interim Committee, a high-level policy group that included Oppenheimer, rejected demonstration for multiple reasons. First, they had too few bombs. If they demonstrated a bomb and Japan didn't surrender, they'd have wasted precious material that couldn't be quickly replaced. Second, a demonstration might fail. If the bomb fizzled or if Japanese officials dismissed it as exaggerated propaganda, the psychological impact would be lost. Third, they doubted a demonstration would convince Japan's military leadership, who'd already ignored devastating conventional bombing campaigns that had killed hundreds of thousands. Fourth, and most pragmatically, American casualties were mounting daily in the Pacific. Every week of continued fighting meant thousands more dead. The military and political leadership wanted immediate, decisive results, not diplomatic experiments. They wanted Japan to surrender now, and they believed that required demonstrating atomic bombs on actual cities with undeniable casualties. The moral complexity of targeting civilians weighed differently on different committee members. Military officers saw the atomic bomb as simply a more efficient weapon. It would kill tens of thousands instead of the hundreds of thousands dying in conventional raids. Strategic bombing had already killed over 300,000 Japanese civilians in incendiary attacks on Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other cities. Curtis LeMay's March 9-10 firebombing of Tokyo had killed over 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would kill. From a military perspective, the atomic bomb was a continuation of existing strategic bombing doctrine, not a moral departure. If incendiary attacks on civilians were acceptable, and they had been conducted with full approval for months, why were atomic attacks different? Scientists at Los Alamos grappled with the moral questions more deeply, but most concluded that using the bombs was justified. Oppenheimer, serving on the interim committee, advised against warning Japan or staging a demonstration. He argued that the shock value required surprise and that only direct military use would force surrender. Oppenheimer would later regret this advice, tormented by the casualties his recommendations enabled. But in May 1945, with the war dragging on and invasion projections climbing toward 1 million casualties, the consensus among military leaders, political officials, and most scientists was that atomic bombs should be used as soon as available against Japanese cities. The Target Committee's work formalized that consensus, translating it into specific target selections that would determine which Japanese cities lived and which died. By early June, the target list was finalized and approved. Hiroshima primary with Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki as alternates. Conventional bombing of these cities was prohibited to preserve them for atomic attack. Aerial reconnaissance photographed them repeatedly, documenting pre-attack conditions for later damage assessment. Military planners coordinated with the 509th Composite Group, the B-29 Squadron training, to deliver atomic bombs, ensuring crews understood the targets, approach routes, and release points. Everything was ready except the bombs themselves. Trinity would prove whether the implosion design worked. If it succeeded, Fat Man would be assembled and shipped to Tinian. Little Boy, using the untested but theoretically reliable gun-type design, would be assembled regardless. By August, weather permitting, one or both bombs would be dropped on Japanese cities selected by committee, destroying targets preserved specifically for atomic attack, killing tens of thousands of people who had no voice in the decision and no knowledge they'd been condemned. June 11, 1945. Chicago. 7 scientists at the Metallurgical Laboratory submitted a report that would be buried and ignored. The Frank Report, named for Chairman James Frank, represented the moral awakening of scientists who'd built atomic bombs to stop Hitler, but now faced using them against Japan. The report argued passionately against surprise use of atomic weapons on cities. It proposed instead a demonstration, detonating a bomb on an uninhabited island or desert, witnessed by international observers, giving Japan a chance to surrender before weapons were used on civilians. The report warned that surprise atomic attacks would inaugurate an arms race, damage American moral authority, and make future arms control impossible. It pleaded for restraint, for thinking beyond immediate military advantage to the long-term implications of how atomic weapons entered human history. The report was forwarded to Secretary of War Stimson, who read it and set it aside. It never reached President Truman before Hiroshima. The moral crisis had been building since Germany's surrender on May 8th. For most Manhattan Project scientists, defeating Nazi Germany had been the justification for building atomic bombs. Many were refugees from fascism, Jews, communists, anyone Hitler's regime had persecuted. They'd fled to America and dedicated themselves to ensuring Hitler didn't get atomic weapons first. That motivation was pure, urgent, morally uncomplicated. But Germany had surrendered before the bombs were ready. The enemy who justified the Manhattan Project no longer existed. Japan remained at war, but Japan hadn't been the original threat. The scientists' moral calculus had changed, and many struggled with what that meant for their work. Leo Szilard felt the shift most acutely. He'd started the Manhattan Project with his letter to Einstein in August 1939, warning about Nazi atomic weapons. Now, 6 years later, Germany was defeated and Szilard wanted to stop. He drafted a petition to President Truman, urging that atomic bombs not be used against Japan without warning and without giving Japanese leadership a chance to surrender under terms they could accept. Szilard circulated the petition at Met Lab and Oak Ridge, collecting signatures from scientists who'd worked on bomb production. Eventually, 155 scientists signed, representing a significant fraction of those aware of the project's full scope. The petition reflected deep moral unease about using weapons of mass destruction against cities, but Szilard's petition faced the same fate as the Frank Report, bureaucratic burial. General Groves intercepted the petition, classified it as secret, and ensured it never reached Truman before the bombings. Groves justified this on security grounds. The petition discussed atomic bombs, therefore it was classified, therefore it couldn't be shown to anyone without appropriate clearance. It was circular reasoning designed to silence dissent. Groves knew that if Truman saw scientists begging him not to use the bombs, it might complicate the decision-making process. Better, from Groves' perspective, to control information flow and ensure military recommendations reach the president without scientific hand-wringing complicating the message. The scientists who'd built the bombs were systematically excluded from decisions about using them. Robert Oppenheimer occupied an impossible position. As Los Alamos director, he'd driven the scientific effort with relentless intensity. He'd recruited scientists, organized research, solved technical problems, and delivered functional weapon designs. He'd also been appointed to the Interim Committee, the civilian advisory body that counseled Truman on atomic policy. In that role, Oppenheimer attended meetings where the decision to use atomic bombs was debated. When asked his opinion, Oppenheimer advised against warning Japan or demonstrating the weapon. He argued that only surprise use against real targets would produce the psychological shock needed to force surrender. It was cold logic, militarily sound, and Oppenheimer would regret it for the rest of his life. The Interim Committee met on May 31st at the Pentagon. Present were Secretary Stimson, James Burns, soon-to-be Secretary of State, Vannevar Bush, James Conant, and 4 scientists, including Oppenheimer. They discussed whether to warn Japan, whether to demonstrate the bomb, whether to target military installations or cities. The scientific panel, Oppenheimer, Fermi, Compton, and Lawrence, concluded that they could propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. The bombs were too precious, too few, and too uncertain to risk on demonstrations that might not convince Japan's military leadership. The consensus emerged: use the bombs on Japanese cities as soon as available, without prior warning, to maximize shock and force immediate surrender. Oppenheimer's recommendation carried enormous weight. If the scientific director of Los Alamos said demonstration was impractical, who could argue otherwise? But Oppenheimer's certainty masked inner conflict. He'd been reading the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture he'd studied in Sanskrit years before. One passage haunted him. The moment when Prince Arjuna, facing a great battle, sees a vision of Krishna revealing his divine form. Krishna tells Arjuna, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Oppenheimer saw himself in that passage, a man who'd unleashed forces beyond human scale, who'd become an agent of destruction, whether he intended it or not. The realization didn't stop him from pushing forward with Trinity and the weapon deployments, but it marked him. After Hiroshima, when people asked how he felt, Oppenheimer quoted that line from the Gita. He'd become death, he'd destroyed worlds, and he'd advised Truman to do it. Not all scientists at Los Alamos shared Oppenheimer's moral certainty. Some, like Szilard and Frank, actively opposed using the bombs on cities. Others felt conflicted but powerless. The decision was above their level, made by military and political leaders they couldn't influence. Still others accepted military logic. The war needed to end. Invasion would cost 1 million casualties. Atomic bombs could prevent that bloodshed. This latter group saw themselves as humanitarians, killing tens of thousands with atomic bombs to prevent killing millions through invasion. The calculus seemed clear, but it required accepting that civilian casualties in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were acceptable costs for ending the war faster. Not everyone could accept that bargain. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who'd escaped occupied Europe and joined the Manhattan Project, had warned Roosevelt in 1944 about the post-war implications of atomic weapons. Bohr argued that atomic bombs would force either world government or world destruction. There was no middle ground. Nations possessing such weapons couldn't coexist in traditional international systems based on military competition. Either they'd create international authority to control atomic weapons, or they'd build increasingly large arsenals until someone used them in a war that destroyed civilization. Bohr had urged Roosevelt to share atomic information with the Soviet Union to begin international control negotiations before the weapons were used. Roosevelt had been intrigued, but took no action. After Roosevelt's death in April 1945, Bohr tried to convince Truman of the same arguments. Truman dismissed him, reportedly complaining that Bohr was too theoretical and impractical. By July 1945, as Trinity approached, the scientists' moral awakening had produced petitions, reports, and warnings, all of which had been filed away or ignored by decision-makers. The scientists who'd built atomic bombs discovered they had no real influence over how those bombs would be used. They had been essential for creating the weapons, but were irrelevant to deployment decisions. Military leaders and political officials would decide whether and how to use atomic bombs based on strategic and political considerations that didn't include scientists' moral qualms. The scientists could continue working, or they could resign and watch the project proceed without them. Most chose to continue, rationalizing that their work would end the war faster, save American lives, and vindicate the Manhattan Project's enormous costs. Whether those justifications would survive contact with the reality of atomic warfare, the burned cities, the radiation casualties, the photographs of victims, remained to be seen. But by July, the decisions were effectively made. The bombs would be used as soon as Trinity proved they worked, and the scientists' protests would be footnotes in histories written by the victors. July 16, 1945, 5:29 a.m. Alamogordo, New Mexico. The world changed in a fraction of a second. 100 feet above the desert floor, inside a sphere of high explosives and plutonium, 32 detonators fired simultaneously. The explosive lenses compressed inward, squeezing a plutonium core to supercritical density. Neutrons flooded the compressed plutonium. Atoms split, releasing more neutrons that split more atoms. The chain reaction multiplied exponentially. 2 became 4. 4 became 8. 8 became 16. 16 became 32. Doubling 80 times in 1 microsecond. Each fission released energy. Billions of fissions released energy equivalent to 25,000 tons of TNT, all concentrated in a space the size of a tennis ball. The temperature at the center exceeded 10 million degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. The fireball vaporized the steel tower holding the device. It turned desert sand into glass. It created a flash of light visible 200 miles away. Humanity had entered the atomic age. The night before, Oppenheimer had barely slept. A thunderstorm rolled across the desert, threatening to postpone the test, or worse, spread radioactive fallout unpredictably. General Groves demanded updates every hour. Could they fire on schedule, or would weather delay everything? Meteorologists predicted the storm would clear by dawn. Groves decided to proceed. At 5:10 a.m., the final countdown began. Oppenheimer stood at the base camp, 10 miles south of Ground Zero, watching through dark glasses. His face was gaunt from stress and sleeplessness. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. For 3 years, he'd driven this project forward, believing absolutely in its necessity. Now, in the minutes before Trinity, doubt crept in. What if the calculations were wrong? What if the implosion failed? What if 3 years of work and $2 billion produced nothing but an expensive dud? At 5:29 and 45 seconds, the world answered. Light erupted from the desert floor, white light brighter than daylight, turning night into noon across the New Mexico desert. Even through dark glasses, even from 10 miles away, the light was blinding. Then came the heat. A wave of thermal radiation that felt like opening an oven door, washing over observers with intensity that left skin tingling. The fireball expanded, rising, changing colors, white to yellow to orange to red, as it cooled and climbed. A mushroom cloud formed, boiling upward, reaching 8 miles into the sky, spreading outward at the top in the distinctive shape that would become the symbol of nuclear weapons. The cloud rose through 40,000 feet, carrying radioactive debris that would drift northeast across New Mexico, contaminating livestock and exposing civilians who had no idea what had happened. The blast wave arrived 30 seconds after detonation. Observers felt it as a powerful gust of wind, strong enough to knock down unsecured equipment. Buildings at base camp shook, windows rattled, the ground trembled. 10 miles away, the overpressure was noticeable but not dangerous. At ground zero, the blast had created a crater 30 feet deep and 1,000 feet wide, pulverizing everything within a radius of a mile. The steel tower, 100 feet tall, anchored in concrete, had simply vanished, vaporized in the first microseconds of the explosion. Where the tower had stood, there was now a crater lined with trinitite, green glass formed from desert sand, fused by the heat of nuclear fire. The glass was radioactive and would remain so for decades. Enrico Fermi conducted an impromptu experiment during the blast. He'd torn strips of paper before the detonation and held them at arm's length. When the shock wave arrived, he dropped the strips and watched how far they blew. By measuring their displacement, Fermi could calculate the blast's energy. His estimate, 10 kilotons, was remarkably accurate for a method using nothing but torn paper and observation. It demonstrated why Fermi was considered one of the world's greatest physicists. He could extract quantitative data from qualitative observations, turning casual experiments into precise measurements. His calculation, done in seconds with scraps of paper, matched the more sophisticated instrumentation data that would be analyzed over following weeks. General Groves, watching from base camp, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. For 3 years, he had pushed this project forward against skepticism, bureaucratic resistance, and technical challenges that experts called insurmountable. He'd spent $2 billion, more than any military project in history except the Manhattan Project itself, on weapons that existed only in theory. He'd committed his career and reputation to a goal that many thought impossible. Trinity proved him right. The bomb worked. The implosion design worked. The Manhattan Project would deliver functional weapons, and those weapons would end the war. Groves immediately began drafting a report for Secretary Stimson, who was at the Potsdam Conference with President Truman, negotiating post-war arrangements with Stalin and Churchill. The report's message was simple: the atomic bomb works, and America has it. Oppenheimer's reaction was more complex. He watched the explosion with a mixture of pride, horror, and something like awe. Later, he would describe his thoughts at that moment using the passage from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." It wasn't triumphalism, but recognition. Recognition that he'd led the effort to create something fundamentally new in human history, something that transcended military victory and entered the realm of existential threat. Other scientists reacted differently. Some laughed with relief, it worked. Some cried, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Most stood silent, trying to process what they'd just seen. They'd created a weapon, yes, but also something more. Proof that human beings could harness nuclear forces. That the theoretical physics they'd studied could become explosive reality. That the world had changed in ways that couldn't be unchanged. The radioactive fallout from Trinity was worse than predicted. The fireball had vaporized tons of earth and debris, sucking it into the mushroom cloud where it mixed with radioactive fission products. As the cloud drifted northeast, this material fell back to Earth as radioactive fallout. Ranchers reported strange ash falling from clear skies. Livestock, cattle and horses, developed radiation burns, lost patches of hair, and in some cases, died. Local residents experienced unexplained illnesses that they didn't connect to the distant explosion. The Army's official story was that an ammunition dump had exploded, a cover story that fooled no one living near the test site but served to prevent widespread panic. Decades later, studies would document elevated cancer rates among populations downwind from Trinity, though establishing direct causation remained difficult. The technical success of Trinity resolved the only remaining question about the Manhattan Project. Did the bombs actually work? The gun-type uranium bomb, Little Boy, had always been considered reliable enough to use without testing. But the implosion design was so complex, so dependent on precise timing and symmetry, that many experts had doubted it could succeed. Trinity proved them wrong. The yield, 25 kilotons, exceeded the most optimistic predictions. The implosion had been symmetric. The compression had achieved supercritical density. The initiator had functioned perfectly. Every component had worked as designed. Fat Man, the plutonium bomb destined for Japan, would use the same design proven at Trinity. Los Alamos could now guarantee that both bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, would detonate when dropped on Japanese cities. Within hours of the Trinity detonation, information began flowing to President Truman at Potsdam. Stimson received Groves's report and immediately briefed the president. Truman, who'd known about the Manhattan Project only since Roosevelt's death in April, now understood that America possessed a weapon of unprecedented power. The timing was extraordinary. Truman was negotiating with Stalin about post-war arrangements and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Now Truman knew he had an alternative to Soviet help: atomic bombs that could force Japanese surrender without Soviet involvement. The balance of power at Potsdam shifted in ways Stalin wouldn't understand until August 6th, when American bombers demonstrated what Trinity had proven possible. The scientists and engineers who'd worked on the Manhattan Project for 3 years had finally seen their work culminate in explosive proof. They'd achieved something that many experts, even within the project, had considered unlikely: building functional atomic weapons in wartime, under impossible deadlines, using technologies that barely existed before the project began. They'd enriched uranium using 3 different methods. They'd produced plutonium in nuclear reactors and extracted it through chemical processes so dangerous they had to be done remotely. They'd designed implosion systems requiring microsecond timing and 3-dimensional precision. They'd solved problems in physics, chemistry, metallurgy, explosives engineering, and industrial production that would have been worthy of decades of research under peacetime conditions. And they'd done it in 3 years, spending $2 billion, employing 130,000 people, and building 3 secret cities. Trinity was vindication. It was proof that the impossible had been made possible through industrial audacity, scientific brilliance, and relentless determination. It was also the point of no return, the moment when atomic weapons transitioned from theoretical possibility to demonstrated reality, from secret project to military option, from physics experiment to strategic weapon that would be used within 3 weeks on cities full of people who couldn't imagine what was coming. August 6th, 1945, 2:45 a.m., Tinian Island. The B-29 bomber, Enola Gay, named after pilot Paul Tibbetts' mother, rolled down the runway carrying a bomb that didn't officially exist. In the bomb bay, secured carefully, was Little Boy, a uranium gun-type weapon containing 64 kilograms of enriched uranium-235, the entire output of Oak Ridge's production facilities. The bomb weighed 9,700 pounds, measured 10 feet long, looked deceptively simple. Inside its steel casing, 2 pieces of uranium waited to be brought together at high velocity. The design had never been tested. The Manhattan Project had only enough enriched uranium for 1 bomb, so they'd skipped testing and proceeded directly to combat use. Confidence in the design was high, based on calculations and small-scale experiments, but no one had actually seen a uranium gun-type bomb explode. Japan was about to find out if the calculations were correct. The mission had been planned meticulously. The 509th Composite Group, commanded by Colonel Tibbetts, had trained for months on Tinian, practicing high-altitude bombing runs with dummy weapons. The crews knew they were preparing for something unusual, the security was unprecedented, the mission profiles were strange, the bombs they practiced with were nicknamed pumpkins for their bulbous shape. But most crew members didn't know what weapon they'd actually drop until days before the mission. On August 1st, Tibbets gathered his crews and told them, atomic bomb, 20,000-ton equivalent, city-destroying power. Some didn't believe him. It sounded like science fiction. How could one bomb equal 20,000 tons of TNT? But orders were orders, and the mission proceeded. Hiroshima had been selected as primary target months earlier by the Target Committee. The city had been spared from conventional bombing, specifically to preserve it for atomic attack. Its 300,000 residents went about their lives unaware that American planners had marked their city for destruction, using a weapon they couldn't imagine. On the morning of August 6th, Hiroshima was waking up under clear skies, perfect bombing weather. At 7:09 a.m., an early warning radar detected American aircraft approaching. Air raid sirens sounded. Civilians who'd endured years of war warnings hurried to shelters, but the aircraft were just weather reconnaissance planes, checking conditions over the target. They passed overhead without dropping bombs. The all-clear sounded. People returned to their routines, going to work, opening shops, starting the day. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the Enola Gay reached bombing altitude, 31,600 feet above Hiroshima. Bombardier Thomas Farabee peered through the Norden bomb site, aligning crosshairs on the Aioi Bridge, the aim point chosen for its distinctive T-shape visible from high altitude. At 8:15 and 15 seconds, Farabee released Little Boy. The bomb fell for 43 seconds, arming itself during descent. Tibbets immediately banked the Enola Gay into a tight 160-degree turn and dove away from the target, trying to gain distance before detonation. The bomb bay cameras recorded Little Boy tumbling toward Hiroshima, shrinking against the city backdrop. At 8:16 a.m., at 1,900 feet above Hiroshima, Little Boy detonated. The bomb released energy equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT in 0.6 seconds. At ground zero, directly beneath the detonation point, the temperature reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything combustible ignited instantly. Steel melted, concrete vaporized. Human beings were reduced to shadows burned into walls. Thermal radiation imprinting their silhouettes onto surfaces before their bodies disintegrated. The blast wave, traveling faster than sound, pulverized buildings within a mile radius. Wooden structures exploded into kindling. Concrete buildings collapsed into rubble. People caught in the open were torn apart by overpressure or impaled by flying debris. The firestorm that followed consumed everything the blast had left standing. Within minutes, the center of Hiroshima had ceased to exist. 70,000 people died instantly or within hours. The exact number will never be known. Many victims were vaporized, leaving no remains to count. Others were burned beyond recognition. Still others staggered from the ruins and died elsewhere, uncounted. Thousands more died in the following weeks from radiation sickness, burns, and injuries. By December 1945, the death toll had reached 140,000. Survivors, the hibakusha, or explosion-affected people, carried physical and psychological scars for life. Burns left keloid scars, raised and disfiguring. Radiation exposure caused cancers that killed decades later. Psychological trauma persisted for generations, and Hiroshima was just the beginning. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second mission launched from Tinian. This time, the bomber was Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, carrying Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb proven at Trinity. The primary target was Kokura, an industrial city with arsenals and munitions factories. But Kokura was obscured by clouds when Boxcar arrived. After 3 bombing runs, Sweeney couldn't achieve visual identification of the aim point, and Bombardier Kermit Bayhan couldn't release the bomb. Fuel was running low. Fat Man was heavier than Little Boy, and Boxcar's fuel consumption had been higher than planned. Sweeney made the decision to proceed to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was also partially obscured by clouds. Sweeney made 3 passes, burning precious fuel, before Bayhan spotted a brief break in the clouds. At 11:02 a.m. local time, Bayhan released Fat Man. The The bomb fell toward Nagasaki, detonating at 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley. The yield, 21 kilotons, exceeded Little Boy's, but the topography of Nagasaki limited the damage. The city was built in valleys with hills between them. The hills absorbed some of the blast and thermal radiation, shielding parts of the city that would have been destroyed if Nagasaki had been as flat as Hiroshima. Still, 40,000 people died instantly. By December, the death toll reached 70,000. Nagasaki, bombed almost by accident. It was the backup target, selected only because clouds obscured the primary, suffered slightly less than Hiroshima, but still experienced devastation beyond anything conventional weapons could inflict. The crews of both aircraft described the explosions in awed, horrified terms. Tibbets, banking the Enola Gay away from Hiroshima, looked back and saw a mushroom cloud rising miles into the sky. The crew took photographs, recorded observations, and fled the area as instructed. On the ground, they had left a burning city and tens of thousands of casualties. The missions were military successes. Both bombs had detonated as designed, both cities had been devastated, and both crews returned safely. But the success came with a human cost that photographs and reports could only hint at. The reality of atomic warfare, the burned bodies, the radiation sickness, the suffering that extended far beyond the moment of detonation, wasn't visible from 30,000 feet. News of the bombings stunned the world. President Truman announced that the United States had used an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, describing it as harnessing the basic power of the universe. He warned Japan to surrender or face a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Truman's statement was calculated to maximize shock and psychological impact. The Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan on August 8th and invaded Manchuria on August 9th, scrambled to understand what atomic bombs meant for post-war politics. Stalin, who'd been informed about the Manhattan Project by Soviet spies, hadn't realized how close America was to functional weapons. Now he understood that the United States possessed a decisive strategic advantage. Japan's leadership struggled to process what had happened. Initial reports from Hiroshima were confused. The city had been destroyed. But by what? One bomb couldn't do that much damage. Some military officers dismissed early reports as exaggerated or mistaken. But as more information arrived, eyewitness accounts, photographs, reports from survivors, the truth became undeniable. A single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb had destroyed Nagasaki. And American radio broadcasts claimed more bombs were ready, more would be dropped, cities would be obliterated one after another until Japan surrendered. The threat was clear: surrender or face systematic atomic destruction. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio, the first time most Japanese had heard his voice, and announced Japan's surrender. He cited a new and most cruel bomb as a reason for ending the war. Whether the atomic bombs alone forced surrender, or whether Soviet entry into the war was equally important, remains debated. Japan's government was already looking for ways to end the war by summer 1945, but the military faction insisted on fighting to the death. The atomic bombs, combined with Soviet invasion of Manchuria, finally overcame military resistance to surrender. On September 2nd, Japan signed formal surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II was over. The atomic bombs had been used twice, on 2 cities, killing over 200,000 people by year's end. They had also accomplished their strategic purpose, ending the war without the invasion that would have killed far more on both sides. Whether that justified the means remains one of history's most debated moral questions. August 7th, 1945, Hiroshima. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya crawled from the wreckage of his house, bleeding from cuts inflicted by flying glass. He was a physician, director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, but he had no idea what had happened to his city. The sky was dark with smoke and debris. Buildings burned everywhere he looked. People wandered past, burned beyond recognition. Skin hanging in sheets, clothes burned off their bodies. Some carried their own severed limbs, too shocked to feel pain. Others begged for water, with voices barely above whispers. Hachia tried to help, but he was injured himself and overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. How could one bomb, if it was a bomb, do this? Over the following days, as he kept a diary documenting what he saw, Hachia would witness something no physician had seen before: radiation sickness, a condition that killed people who seemed to be recovering from their injuries. The immediate deaths, those killed by blast, burns, and trauma in the first minutes after detonation, were horrible but comprehensible. Conventional bombing killed people the same ways. But the delayed deaths, starting days or weeks after exposure, mystified doctors. Patients who'd survived the blast with minor injuries suddenly developed symptoms no one could explain. They vomited blood. Their hair fell out in clumps. They hemorrhaged from gums, noses, and under the skin. Their white blood cell counts dropped precipitously. They weakened and died despite treatment. Doctors recognized signs of severe infection, but couldn't understand why so many people were developing it simultaneously. They didn't yet know about radiation sickness, the systematic destruction of bone marrow, immune systems, and gastrointestinal linings caused by exposure to ionizing radiation. The black rain that fell after the bombings terrified survivors. Shortly after the detonations, dark, oily rain fell across Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Radioactive fallout, condensing in smoke and debris, dropping back to Earth. People caught in the rain thought it was ordinary rainfall. Some drank from puddles to relieve their thirst. Others used the rainwater to wash burns. They didn't know they were absorbing radioactive particles that would increase their cancer risks for decades. Children played in contaminated areas. Families returned to destroyed homes to search for possessions, spending hours in highly radioactive environments. The invisible danger of radiation, tasteless, odorless, undetectable without instruments, meant that many survivors received additional exposure after the initial detonations. The shadows burned into walls and pavement haunted those who saw them. At ground zero and in nearby areas, thermal radiation had been so intense that people were vaporized instantly. Their bodies blocked thermal radiation long enough to leave shadows on surfaces behind them, human silhouettes permanently marked on walls, bridges, and sidewalks. These shadows were all that remained of some victims, eerie memorials to people whose names and stories would never be known. Survivors walking through the ruins saw these shadows and understood. A person had stood here, and now only their shadow remains. It was a visceral reminder that nuclear weapons didn't just kill, they erased people from existence. The medical challenges facing survivors overwhelmed Japan's capacity to respond. Hospitals were destroyed or damaged. Medical supplies were exhausted. Many doctors and nurses had been killed in the blasts. Those who survived worked in makeshift facilities without adequate equipment, medication, or knowledge. They treated burns using whatever materials were available: vegetable oil, ash, improvised bandages. They amputated crushed limbs with inadequate anesthesia. They watched patients die from radiation sickness without understanding what was killing them. American occupation forces eventually brought medical supplies and established research programs to study radiation effects, but in the immediate aftermath, survivors suffered and died with minimal medical intervention. Keloid scars became a lasting mark of atomic bomb exposure. Unlike ordinary burn scars, keloids formed raised, thick tissue that grew beyond the original wound. Many hibakusha developed keloids covering large portions of their bodies: faces, arms, backs, scars that were disfiguring and painful. The keloids marked them as atomic bomb survivors, subjecting them to discrimination that persisted for decades. In Japanese society, hibakusha faced prejudice in employment, marriage, and social interactions. Some hid their exposure history to avoid discrimination. Others lived openly as survivors, bearing witness to what atomic weapons did to human beings. Their testimony would become crucial to anti-nuclear movements and arms control advocacy in the following decades. The long-term health effects of radiation exposure emerged slowly. Cancer rates among hibakusha were elevated compared to unexposed populations. Leukemia appeared within years of exposure, peaking in the early 1950s. Solid cancers, lung, thyroid, breast, colon increased over decades. Cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and immune system disorders occurred at higher rates among survivors. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation, established by American and Japanese governments, studied Hibakusha health outcomes for decades, documenting radiation's long-term impacts. This research provided much of the scientific understanding of radiation biology and informed safety standards for nuclear workers and medical radiation exposure. The Hibakusha, in effect, became an unwilling experiment in human radiation exposure. Their suffering generated data that protected others. The psychological trauma affected entire generations. Survivors carried memories of the bombings, the flash, the heat, the burned cities, the dead and dying, for the rest of their lives. Many developed what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, inability to speak about their experiences. Children who survived carried trauma into adulthood, affecting their own children and grandchildren. Some Hibakusha became activists, sharing their stories despite painful memories, driven by belief that bearing witness might prevent future nuclear warfare. Others remained silent, unwilling or unable to discuss what they had experienced. Both responses reflected the immense psychological burden of surviving atomic bombings. By December 1945, the combined death toll from Hiroshima and Nagasaki had reached approximately 210,000. Over the following years and decades, radiation-induced cancers and other diseases would claim tens of thousands more lives. The total casualties attributed to the atomic bombings eventually exceeded 400,000. These numbers, while horrifying, were actually lower than some military planners had expected. Projections for invading Japan had estimated between 1 million and 4 million American casualties, plus comparable or higher Japanese casualties, including massive civilian deaths from fighting, starvation, and continued bombing campaigns. By this grim calculus, the atomic bombs, despite their horrific immediate effects and long-term consequences, resulted in fewer total deaths than the alternatives. But numbers couldn't capture the moral dimension of what had happened. 2 cities had been selected by committee, preserved from conventional bombing specifically to serve as demonstration targets for atomic weapons, and then destroyed with weapons whose effects on human beings were only partially understood. The decision to use atomic bombs on cities rather than military targets, to attack without warning rather than after demonstration, to prioritize immediate military victory over long-term arms control, these choices shaped how nuclear weapons entered human history. The Hibakusha and the destroyed cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of atomic warfare's horror, motivating arms control efforts and anti-nuclear movements for decades. But the same events also demonstrated that atomic weapons worked, that they could destroy cities, that they could force enemy surrender. Lessons that drove Cold War nuclear arsenals to terrifying sizes. The reckoning of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continues today, in debates about nuclear weapons, in testimonies from aging survivors, in ruins preserved as memorials, in the question that still has no final answer. Was it necessary? The only certainty is that the consequences, medical, psychological, political, and moral, extended far beyond the moments of detonation, and will continue affecting humanity as long as nuclear weapons exist. August 29, 1949. Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. A mushroom cloud rose over the Soviet steppes, visible for miles across the flat landscape. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning by Soviet scientists, designated Joe 1 by American intelligence. The explosion yielded 22 kilotons, comparable to the bombs dropped on Japan. American officials were stunned. Intelligence estimates had predicted the Soviets wouldn't have atomic weapons until the mid-1950s. How had they succeeded so much faster? The answer, confirmed decades later through declassified documents and confessions, was espionage. Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, David Greenglass, and other Soviet spies had provided enough information to accelerate Soviet bomb development by 1 to 2 years. America's nuclear monopoly which Truman had expected to last a decade, ended in 4 years. The atomic age had become the nuclear age, and the Cold War arms race had begun. The Manhattan Project had been conceived as a wartime measure: build atomic bombs to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But the project's success created consequences that extended far beyond World War II. The bombs worked. They could destroy cities. They had forced enemy surrender. These facts changed international relations fundamentally. Nations possessing atomic weapons had decisive advantages over nations that didn't. But if multiple nations possessed them, what would prevent nuclear war? This question, how to manage nuclear weapons in a world of competing powers, defined post-war diplomacy and sparked an arms race that brought humanity closer to extinction than any previous conflict. American officials initially assumed nuclear monopoly would last long enough to establish international control. The Baruch Plan, proposed in June 1946, offered to transfer American nuclear technology to an international authority that would manage atomic energy peacefully. But the plan required all nations, including the Soviet Union, to submit to inspections and give up independent nuclear programs before America surrendered its weapons. Stalin rejected this as a scheme to preserve American advantage. He directed Soviet scientists to build their own bombs as quickly as possible, providing unlimited resources and threatening consequences for failure. The Soviet bomb program became a crash effort mirroring the Manhattan Project's intensity. With one crucial advantage: Soviet spies had provided design information that saved years of research. The Soviet test in August 1949 shocked American leaders and triggered panic about security. How had the Soviets obtained atomic secrets so quickly? Investigations pointed toward espionage, leading to spy hunts that destroyed careers and fueled anti-communist hysteria. Klaus Fuchs was arrested in February 1950 in Britain, confessed, and provided information leading to other spies. His confession led to Harry Gold, whose testimony implicated David Greenglass. Greenglass testified against his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, and Rosenberg's wife Ethel, resulting in their conviction and execution in June 1953. The Rosenberg trial became a flashpoint in Cold War politics. Some saw them as traitors who'd betrayed atomic secrets to America's adversary, others as victims of anti-communist witch hunts. Decades later, declassified Venona transcripts confirmed Julius Rosenberg's espionage activities, though Ethel's involvement remained ambiguous. The revelation of Soviet espionage intensified security paranoia across American nuclear programs and government agencies. Loyalty oaths became mandatory. Background checks expanded. Scientists who'd worked on the Manhattan Project faced renewed scrutiny of their pre-war political associations. This paranoia eventually targeted Oppenheimer. In December 1953, he was accused of security violations based on his pre-war communist associations, his relationship with John Tatlock, his inconsistent statements about the Chevalier incident, and his post-war opposition to developing hydrogen bombs. Oppenheimer's security clearance hearing in April-May 1954 was a show trial. He was denied access to classified documents relevant to his defense, while prosecutors cited those same documents against him. His clearance was revoked, ending his government advisory role and publicly humiliating the man who led Los Alamos. The hearing reflected Cold War anxieties more than legitimate security concerns. Oppenheimer had never actually spied, but his past associations and current policy positions made him a target. Meanwhile, the arms race accelerated. American scientists, led by Edward Teller, developed thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs using fusion rather than fission. The first American thermonuclear test, Mike, detonated November 1, 1952, at Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The yield was 10.4 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than Little Boy. The explosion vaporized the island of Elugalab, leaving a crater 6,000 feet in diameter. The Soviet Union tested its first thermonuclear weapon in August 1953. Both superpowers rapidly developed arsenals of fusion weapons with no practical upper limit on yield. A single hydrogen bomb could destroy an entire metropolitan area. Dozens could destroy a nation. Thousands could end human civilization. The Castle Bravo test in March 1954 demonstrated the uncontrollable power of thermonuclear weapons. Predicted to yield 6 megatons, the bomb actually produced 15 megatons, the largest American nuclear test ever conducted. The yield was 2.5 times larger than expected because scientists had underestimated lithium-7's contribution to the fusion reaction. The massive explosion scattered radioactive fallout far beyond predicted zones. The Japanese fishing boat Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon 5, was contaminated 100 miles from the test site, outside the declared danger zone. All 23 crew members suffered radiation sickness. One died 7 months later. The incident became international news, embarrassing the United States and demonstrating that hydrogen bomb fallout could affect populations far from detonation sites. By the mid-1960s, the United States and Soviet Union possessed combined arsenals exceeding 60,000 nuclear warheads. Both nations maintained bombers on continuous alert, missiles in hardened silos, submarines carrying nuclear weapons beneath the oceans, all capable of launching within minutes of receiving orders. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD, emerged as a strategic framework. Neither nation could attack without guaranteeing its own destruction through retaliatory strikes. This balance of terror prevented direct superpower conflict, but created persistent risk that accident, miscalculation, or technical failure could trigger nuclear war. Several incidents, false alarms from radar systems, misinterpreted exercises, communication failures, brought the world close to accidental nuclear war during the Cold War decades. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought humanity closest to nuclear annihilation. Soviet missiles in Cuba could strike American cities with little warning. President Kennedy imposed a naval blockade and demanded removal of the missiles. Soviet Premier Khrushchev initially refused. For 13 days, the world held its breath as the superpowers confronted each other with thousands of nuclear weapons ready to launch. Back-channel negotiations finally resolved the crisis. The Soviets removed missiles from Cuba, the Americans removed missiles from Turkey. But the proximity to nuclear war terrified leaders on both sides. After the crisis, both nations established a direct communication hotline, the Red Telephone, to prevent future miscommunications from escalating into war. Gradual arms control efforts reduced, but didn't eliminate, nuclear arsenals. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited atmospheric nuclear testing, reducing radioactive fallout. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 attempted to prevent spread of nuclear weapons to additional nations, though several countries, Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea, developed weapons anyway. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, SALT, and Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, START, between the United States and Soviet Union, capped and eventually reduced strategic nuclear arsenals. By the 2020s, combined stockpiles had decreased from Cold War peaks of 70,000 warheads to approximately 13,000. But 13,000 nuclear weapons, even with delivery systems less immediate than Cold War alerts, still represented enough destructive power to end human civilization multiple times over. The Manhattan Project's legacy, 7 decades after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, remains profoundly ambiguous. The project succeeded brilliantly at its wartime goal, producing atomic weapons that ended World War II without the million-plus casualties projected for invading Japan. The bombs worked, the war ended, American lives were saved. But the project also inaugurated the nuclear age, making possible weapons of such destructive power that their use could end human civilization. The scientists who built atomic bombs gave humanity a tool that continues threatening our existence. Some Manhattan Project veterans spent their post-war years advocating for arms control. Szilard, Rotblat, and others argued that nuclear weapons should be eliminated before they eliminated us. Others, like Teller, promoted nuclear weapons as guarantors of national security. Oppenheimer became a tragic figure, celebrated for wartime leadership, persecuted for post-war caution, forever associated with the quote about becoming death. Today, 9 nations possess nuclear weapons. The United States, Russia, Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. The total arsenal, while smaller than Cold War peaks, remains capable of destroying civilization. The doomsday clock, a symbolic measure maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since 1947, stands at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to catastrophe it has ever been, reflecting not only nuclear risks, but also climate change and biological threats that could end civilization. The Manhattan Project opened possibilities for energy, medicine, and scientific understanding, but also created existential risks that future generations must manage. Whether humanity can possess nuclear weapons indefinitely without using them remains an open question. The shadow cast by Trinity in July 1945, by Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, extends across human history, darkening the future with the knowledge that we possess the power to destroy ourselves and the uncertainty of whether we'll find the wisdom to prevent it.